This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. I suppose we could find some light relief this morning from keeping a close ear on my newsreading colleagues as they wrestle once again with the words rare red wind weather warning. I wonder if any of them will have the confidence to go for all 5 of those words, or whether we'll hear various variations of sort of 2, 3 or 4 of them. A red wind weather warning, a rare weather warning. I don't know. We will see. And yeah, I would quite like to postpone the moment when we have to start talking about one of the most hideous crimes imaginable. I can't sort of come at it without this word evil in my head, about 30 foot high. Some people don't like the use of the word evil. I balk at it sometimes. I certainly balk at it in the absence of detail until you hear the court testimony yesterday and some of the descriptions, and you realise you probably don't have the vocabulary. The English language perhaps doesn't have the vocabulary properly to articulate how horrific this crime was, how unutterably disgusting it was. You have, if you're anything like me, you have a kind of desire to understand things. If you understand things, they somehow become a little bit more, well, obviously they become more comprehensible. That's what comprehensible means, understandable. But somehow you can dilute some of the terror if you have a reason, which is why, oddly, terrorism is different from the case that we've seen. If someone thinks that they're going to go to heaven and get 72 virgins or bring about the independence and autonomy of their home territory or, unite Ireland or whatever it may be, then, and they do something hideous, they do something absolutely abominable, then there is an answer to the question of why. That's the difference, I suppose, between terrorism and what would we call this? I mean, Keir Starmer, of course, positing the notion that we should expand the meaning of the word. It certainly causes terror, but for no purpose other than apparently the satisfaction of the perpetrator. So it's more kind of Fred West, Harold Shipman kind of territory, I suppose, than it is September the 11th or Manchester Arena bombing. That's probably the act of terrorism that prompted, because children were the victims, and when children are the victims, the heart responds and the head responds differently from how it does when adults are the victims. What have you been thinking about as you've sought to process this crime, this atrocity? Obviously, I'm aware some people will be desperate to use it as a way in which to malign entire demographics, entire ethnicities, or everybody from a certain background. That's hideous. That makes everything worse. Well, I mean, particularly in the context of immigration, when the parents of one of the little girls that was murdered are immigrants. And if we learned anything yesterday, it's that if he hadn't been stopped, he would have killed every child in the room, regardless of creed or colour or any other attribute. But, we live in a world at the moment where the people who would have been gleefully hoping that this crime did turn out to endorse and enforce their own carefully nurtured prejudices are louder and more prevalent than I can remember them being. So there's that response, which I don't think will. Yes, you're right, James. The New Zealand mosque massacre as well. You get some atrocities where you know why people have done it. But the ones where you don't, the ones where there's no ideology or manifesto, another 17-year-old in the news in America this week for undertaking a murder of one of his schoolmates. And he turned out to be a man of colour who hated people of colour. And was sympathetic to Nazi ideology. So somehow it fills the space. I'd never noticed that before today. I would have thought, if you'd asked me, cold, I'd have thought that terrorism was worse than other kinds of crime. I probably will again next week, but at the moment, there's something so bleak about an absence of any explanation, because it speaks to a darkness at the heart of humanity that I think many of us would rather not contemplate. And that brings me to the parents, not to the question of whether they could have done more. We looked at that earlier in the week, and we may come to it later today, but the question of their faith, reported pretty much everywhere as devout Catholics, a religion I know more about than any other. And what you learn in the cradle, from the cradle as a Catholic, is the presence of evil in the world. I mean, if you were trying to explain it to somebody who's been nowhere near this kind of thing, you would struggle, wouldn't you, to make a strong case. But we've had thousands of years of humanity to very, very carefully hone our species' reliance on religion. And a big part of it is the presence of evil. So I grew up terrified of Satan. I grew up terrified of the devil, would you believe? And so did almost everybody who went through an education system similar to mine. So these devoutly Catholic parents may well be looking at their son and seeing someone possessed, if you like, by the spirit of evil, possessed by Beelzebub. It sounds mad, right, saying this out loud, but you only have to read the Bible for 5 minutes to understand the role that this has played in Judeo-Christian culture for as long as Judeo-Christian culture has been around. And people still balk at the use of the word evil. I want to talk today about your relationship with that word, about your relationship with that concept. I heard a couple of Nick's callers use the word innate. I also heard a couple talk about some sort of hatred of white people, which is kind of proof of the point I was making a moment ago about people being so desperate to smuggle in their own prejudices that they'll use even a crime like this, lies and nonsense and misinformation about even a crime like this to peddle their own prejudices. But that use of the word innate speaks to the broader social question of isolation, particularly of young men. But you could isolate 1 million young men and you would not end up, please God, to bring religion into it again, you would not end up with 1 million monsters like this man, this person. So do you know what I mean? Correlation is not causation, but equally, I can imagine a world in which he did not become this killer. I can imagine a course of life from his childhood to today when he did not become this killer. I guess that brings predestination into the question, another religious concept. But it's that notion of evil that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how helpful it is, really. Some of you are adamant that it isn't helpful. Well, it helps me on a day like today. I don't know that I'm minded at the moment to apologise for that. It's the first time in a long time that I've felt that comfort, if you like, from the existence of evil. And comfort's the right word to use because that's why religions contain it. If I was feeling provocative, I could say something like, that's why religions invented it. That's why they invented the devil in the same way that they invented God. Because it's comforting. It's also controlling. It is an influence upon your behavior in this world if you believe that it's going to affect what happens in the next world. So evil plays a huge role in, I think, in all cultures, but certainly in the only ones that I'm familiar with. And in my religion I was raised in, evil is personified by the devil. And that is why we talk about possession, and that's why we talk about rejecting Satan and all his works. You say that in baptisms, you know. So when you tell me we shouldn't use the word evil, you're telling me really that Judeo-Christian culture is bogus or is unhelpful. And you may be right, but I don't know if you've thought about it that way before. I find it helpful today to think of this person as being evil. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? 0345 6060 973. The other worry I've got has been picked up by Mike, who says, I'm so relieved that he wasn't a Muslim or an asylum seeker, not that it will stop Farage and his ilk trying to grift off the back of this tragedy. It's quite disgusting. There's another element of the conversation that we haven't had yet, which is if he had turned out to be all of the things that some public figures seem to spend their lives telling us, or did in some cases tell us that he was, it wouldn't have justified any of the responses that we saw in the summer. And yet that seems to be missing from the conversation. Today's not the day for that bit of the dialogue, though. Today's the day for a conversation about evil. I suppose I'm asking whether it exists or not. And if it doesn't exist, how do you account for what has happened here? I'll read this from Anthony. I'll read as many messages as I can today. Because there are no definitive answers to any of the questions that I'm asking you. James, imagine being autistic, bullied, with parents telling you about how real hell is, about Satan and about evil, and then you decide that you simply must be evil and you lean into it. We'll never really know, I don't imagine. But when you see the footage, and I don't look at much of it, I just can't, I'm afraid, but the ease with which you can find online atrocities. We spoke earlier in the week about one that he literally watched, the stabbing of a bishop in New Zealand that he literally watched in the hour before he went to the dance class in Southport, and it was still up at the time of talking on Elon Musk's platform. And that was relatively mild compared to some of the stuff that you will stumble across. When I was on Twitter, I haven't looked at Twitter for weeks, but when I was on there, the growing popularity of accounts that just posted footage of violent crime being committed by people of colour designed to foster racism, but exposure to that sort of violence I don't want to use this phrase, excite is a better phrase than the one I was about to use. Some people derive excitement from that footage. It's designed to terrorise. It's designed, obviously, to make you hate all people of a certain demographic or of a certain background. But that's not necessarily, that's not the effect it will have on everybody. Some people will be excited by it, and it will trigger something inside them that grows into the kind of atrocity, mercifully rare, that we witnessed in Southport. And is that thing evil? And if it is it in all of us? I mean, are there things? Look at the Holocaust, which we'll be commemorating on Monday. Ordinary people. I always remember my friend Lily. You met Lily a few times. She's not with us anymore. We lost her during the lockdowns. But I remember Lily Pullman telling me about the superintendent in her block, who, when they started rounding up Jews, she ended up hiding for the duration of the Second World War in the attic of one of her mother's colleagues. You can hear her story on the full disclosure interview that we did together. But one of the things she told me that stays with me is that the superintendent in the building where they lived took her father's watch. It might not sound like an act of evil, and in the context of what we're talking about today, of course, it seems trivial, but it was because he could, you know. Because he could, because they were Jewish, and he knew that they would do anything to keep his protection, if you like. So he took her father's watch. So that question about could it be in all of us is not as mad as it seems in the first moment of asking. If you think about a Holocaust, you think about completely ordinary people doing absolutely hideous things, becoming almost normalised. So that makes me think that the concept of evil is helpful. A couple of things. Steve says, by talking about this killer, we're giving him what he wanted. Yeah, I think, none of us, well, some people listening will be qualified psychologists, but I'm not, neither forensic nor criminal. But I think he wants notoriety. I think he wants to sort of revel in some of the people he was obsessed with, serial killers, genocidal dictators, terrorists. I think he does want a sort of form of notoriety. I'm going to try not to say his name again, that tiny little gesture that I can make on this program. If you think it's the wrong gesture, drop me a note and tell me why, and if I agree with you, I'll change back again. But I don't think there's anything to be gained from saying his name, and I think Steve might be right when he says he'd like nothing more than to be listening to a program like this on a day like today. And and feeling pleasure, for want of a better word, in the notoriety that he's achieved. He said, I'm glad they're dead. I'm glad the children are dead, after he was arrested. So, what is evil? 0345 6060 973. And what's your relationship with it? Will his parents be deriving succour from their belief in Satan? Or will their belief in God be shaken to its core by what he has, in their view, capital H, he, what he has permitted to happen? It's also one of those days where you don't have to answer my question directly. If there's something you want to get off your chest in the way that I've just been free to explore my thoughts and feelings with you, then you can do the same with me. In all circumstances, you need 0345 6060 973 to get involved. It's 10:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 10. It's an overused word, but that doesn't mean that it should never be used at all. And the word is evil. Evil prevails when good men do nothing. One texter tells me we are all to blame. And I didn't know this about Buddhism. It's a religion I'm very ignorant of. But Alison practices it, and she says we talk about fundamental negativity, an energy that naturally exists in the world, and its potential in all of us. We believe that this fundamental negativity is the dominance of greed, hatred, and ignorance. Well, there's plenty of that around. Matt's in Dartford. Matt, what made you pick up the phone?
I was just listening, and having worked at a high secure hospital for 6 years prior, I've been around people that have done some horrific things, as you can imagine, killing family members and other things. Yes. And my distinction...
What were you doing there, if you don't mind me asking?
I was a rehabilitation assistant, and I also worked in the health and fitness department, so I had a lot of time. All of my hours were around patients, apart from my half-hour break. So, but just having worked there, obviously, one, you don't see half of the horrific things out there, which is, and I think the clear distinction for me is someone who I've known to has, like, say, killed a couple of family members, which is absolutely horrific, should never be let out. But they may have, I don't want to say mitigating circumstances, but something's driven, like an external factor. So they've got either a mental illness, they've been radicalised, there's been some sort of, something has happened to trigger it, and then there's other people that are evil and have done something because they want to do it. Nobody's influenced them. They've got no mental illness. They've done it for the pure satisfaction of, I want to kill someone, and I basically get excited about that. And there's no explanation. There's no drive, no manifesto. There's no parents aren't bad. Parents are nuclear family, if you like, for example. So there's not even I was a single parent household. That's what's done it. There's nothing, and they still just do it anyway. And is that
most people at the hospital, secure hospital where you work, comfortable with that concept? Is it? I mean, because when you see that graph, if you like, and you know that this person has reacted to this impetus and this stimulus and this influence and this trauma or whatever it may be, and then this person is just doing it for fun.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to downplay what some people have done.
I know you're not.
You look at somebody and you can almost...
Well, we can be driven mad, can't we? By experiences and then do things, which is why you're in a hospital, not a prison.
Exactly, and I think I'm not trying to... I would never sort of want to sound like I'm empathising with people, but there are people that are truly unwell, and I feel sorry for them because they're unwell.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that's the difference. I think even, and this is where it really comes down to, is you have other patients that are unwell that will hear or see or be told what other patients have done by that patient, for example, because they gloat. Like, I'm happy they're dead, for example. And then they'll be like, that's a bad person, they're evil. Even though they've gone and killed their mum 2 years before, they'll still recognise that and be like, that person is a really...
But how do we know this word innate is one that comes up a lot, as opposed to, and the reason that they're in hospital is because, in a sense, what we're calling evil, the diagnosticians are calling illness.
Yeah, there's usually, I mean, to get into the intricacies of it, usually people that have these illnesses or have done these sort of horrific things, there's normally some sort of childhood trauma or some sort of trigger early in their life or later on in their life, whereas, like I said, I don't understand, as far as I'm concerned, this person was raised as a Christian or Catholic all their life. They've lived here all their life. They've got two parents. There's no nothing in that court document says he had a horrific PTSD-related incident in his life that could have triggered him to become this way. He's just had a fascination.
I think he had a tough time at school. But even if he had a PTSD type, there'll be millions of people who have had that as well, and to them this hasn't happened. So in some ways, the word evil moves into the space when you're looking at what it is that sees 10 people who have the same experience, and one of them reacts in a hideous way. There's something there in that one person that explains why he didn't react like the other 9 people did. And I think evil is the best word I can think of. A capacity for evil, maybe, rather than evil itself. But how do we know it's not in everybody? I wasn't expecting to bring the Holocaust into the conversation, Matt, but how do we know it's not in everybody?
I think everyone has capacity for it. I think it's just people have rational sense of thought. I mean, I'm not saying I have the feelings to do that sort of thing when I'm walking behind slow people in a shop, but people get very frustrated and angry about the most inconvenient minor things in life. But the difference is some people in that place would have that inconvenience and stab you. Yeah. And we don't, because we have like rational thought and sense, and some people just don't have that.
And then we're veering closer to what feels like an absence of responsibility, and we call it illness or call it anything else. That's fascinating, Matt. I'm glad you were listening today. I presume, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I presume 6 years is about as much as you could cope with yourself.
Yeah, well, yeah. Basically, they say that if you stay too long, you end up becoming one of the patients yourselves.
I can believe. I mean, I don't think I could do it for 6 hours, let alone six years. But yeah, I did sort of find myself thinking when you mentioned the amount of time that probably is about the upper limit on what people could cope with in that daily exposure to what we are today describing, until someone tells us that we shouldn't. We're describing it as evil. 10:27 is the time. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's a bit of nature nurture, isn't it, as well, which we talk about in all sorts of contexts, not often as gross as this one, but how much is it nature as opposed to nurture? Eugene is in Virginia Water. Eugene, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Well, I was listening to you earlier, and sort of similar to you, I grew up in a Catholic household, and with religion in my life as a younger person, and as I've grown older, have kind of tried to think, how does religion play a part in my life? Do I believe in everything I was taught, etc., etc.? But that notion of good and evil is kind of something that you grow up with.
It's the absolute core of it, isn't it, really?
It is, and you accept that evil is definitely a thing. But, I have to say, as I've, actually my wife, when I met her, she has this notion that there's always a reason, there's always something, and that I find it hard to believe that evil is a entity of its own right. I think it's what we call an absence of humanity, or an absence of rational thought or better judgment. And Lord knows these days, it's so much of this can be diagnosed and all the rest of it. But I don't think anybody's born an evil person. I think it's bad wiring. I think something happens in that brain to say, actually, I'm not going to stop myself from this, or that sounds fun,
it's not bad wiring.
I'm going to do it.
It's not because that then means Holocausts would never happen, because there would not be enough people.
Which is then an extension of that, though, right? Because it's people who know it's wrong.
When presented with an opportunity, they can go in one of several ways, and they go in a way that we historically call evil.
Exactly. And
but I think that's
what we call evil, though, right?
This character seemed to relish what he was doing,
Yeah.
Again,
that's got to be mental illness. That's got to be something in his brain.
I don't think it does. People like doing disgusting things. It's not mental sadism. Sadism's not a mental illness. People pay to be whipped by prostitutes. That's not a mental illness. Some people derive pleasure.
Seriously weird, but
well, to you and me, but not to them. And they derive pleasure from that. And some people derive pleasure from doing the whipping. And this man derives pleasure from doing despicable crimes.
Yeah, true. I mean, I guess I like to think that as human beings, we're different from other animals on this planet because we have that capacity for compassion and
very few animals kill for fun.
Yeah, exactly so. Which makes me think that, well, there has to be something wrong in the way their brains put together that makes this okay somehow.
Well, yeah, but not wrong in a diagnostic sense, just wrong in the opposite of right. And then we're back to good and evil, where the conversation began. Eugene, thank you. 10:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Just apropos the Holocaust and recent news that we've touched on this week, the head of Germany's largest concentration camp memorial has called Elon Musk a mad extremist who should read up on history after the billionaire endorsed the hard right alternative for Germany as the country's last spark of hope before next month's election. Just a reminder of the news agenda at the moment that in some ways, because we'll look later in the program probably about what happens when you spend your life online exposed to the kind of hideous footage that has become more and more prevalent and more commonplace as platforms like Elon Musk's achieve more and more power. 10:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:34 is the time. Nora says, I think calling the perpetrator evil is an oversimplification of the matter. It may well be, Nora, but it doesn't stop it being comforting in a way, in a strange way. As a population demographic researcher, she writes, what we learn from our research studies is that there are always a multitude of variables that need to be factored in when discussing matters like this, including background, socioeconomic, environmental, mental, and access to healthcare. I'm not condoning the young man's action, but brushing the statement such as evil reduces the depth of the conversation. I don't necessarily agree. I think the conversation it has been and will continue to be fruitful and interesting, but I stress again that we're not confined to that simple question. And again, at risk of oversimplifying, if you take into account all of those things, if you conducted an experiment where background, socioeconomic status, environmental issues, mental health issues, access to healthcare, all of those variables in a theoretical experiment were identical, and one person ends up doing what this person did and the other person doesn't, what word would you use to describe that distinction, to describe what the person who did these acts was or had? To distinguish himself from the person with the, laboratory conditions, identical collection of variables. 10:35 is the time. Catherine's in Southport. Catherine, what made you pick up the phone?
I wanted to talk about Axel Rudikabana's father because I met him. He was a student in my classes. I taught GCSE maths in a local college, and he attended the foundation class and the higher class. And I've always remembered him because I was very struck by him because he came across as a very, very gentle, very, very calm man, and he integrated so well into the groups, and everybody liked him because he had this calm, kind of kind way about him. And he sat with other students who weren't very good at maths, and he helped them. Like there was one lady that he sat next to every week in the foundation class, and she was a loud scouser, and she was the opposite from him. Right. But he kind of befriended her, and she was the weakest in maths. I thought she's never going to pass, and she passed because of him, and he helped her every week, and they became kind of quite close in that learning environment.
Wow.
And then when in the summer when they got their results, my father had died just before the results came out, and I didn't go down to the hall where they were all getting their results, and he appeared on the corridor where I was, and he could tell I was upset. And I told him that my father had died, and he was, his reaction was just full of compassion. And he then wrote me a really beautiful letter, which I've got somewhere, but I haven't read it for years, but it'll be somewhere. And, it was obviously Christian,
Yeah.
But that was my experience of that person's father, and I just think that gets lost out there where people make all manner of assumptions, about the parents and say all kinds of things about the parents, and I just kind of want people to know that that's what I experienced as that man's father.
How have you been processing what we've all been processing, but with your very personal perspective on the family?
Well, it's just like obviously it's a horrendous thing, in Southport, living in Southport, and it was an unbelievable thing, but it was just made worse and what made more personal to me because I knew the father. I've met lots of people who knew the families of the girls. I sort of helped with the flowers. I went and helped with the flowers, so I talked to lots of people who were bringing flowers and to the centre of Southport, and I did that over the summer, but at the same time I wanted people to know. I didn't want his parents just written off, because they didn't do it.
And a lot of the
I'm sure
language.
They'll be devastated.
Well, there's a big headline in one newspaper today asking whether they could and should have done more. It's a question we've turned our attention to on this programme. I think it's an inevitable human reaction, but it's an unanswerable question, really. Have you, and you don't have to answer this, have you thought about reaching out to him?
I have. Well, the only way I could, because I don't like we can't keep contact details. And this, it was years ago. Okay. It was, it was probably 8 years ago. He was my student, and you don't keep in touch with people like that. But I did. I have seen something online where I've tried to. I've tried to because.
And he was a great comfort to you when you lost your father.
Well, yes, I just always remembered, and, I probably kept that letter, and I'd never met anybody from Rwanda before, and, there was this sadness about him, which I kind of always thought probably comes from what he's experienced. Yes. It gave me the sense that they'd experienced something,
what do you know,
terrible.
Just tell me when you've had enough, because this can't be an easy conversation for you to have, but what did he talk about the rest of the family much? Because there's a brother, I think, who's confined to a wheelchair, isn't there?
Well, yes, So when he never mentioned the younger one, which is Axel Rudakapana, but the elder one, I remember him being really concerned and talking about him having this mystery condition, which was resulting in him losing the use of his legs.
Right.
And him being really concerned, and because I kind of just thought things just, I think he was driving a taxi, the father, and was a very bright man, and had aspirations in terms of maybe becoming an accountant. He even said he would like to be a maths teacher, and I thought, gosh, things seem to be hard for you. And then he was telling me this really sad story about his son, and he's telling me how good his son was at maths. So he came across as a very caring, kind parent.
Can only begin to imagine what they're going through, can't you?
No, can't imagine.
No, you're right.
Can't imagine.
You can't.
But the people, I've told lots of people, and some people, they just haven't got any time for it. They just, they don't want to hear my story about, because they've got no sympathy. But a lot of people also have got sympathy for the parents.
To have sympathy for the people who don't have sympathy, at risk of overcomplicating matters, is that it helps people process the unprocessable, doesn't it? To sometimes make the easy, to draw the easy conclusions, and to make the easy finger pointing of blame, because it takes away the sense of chaos. It takes away the really frightening thought that this is random and chaotic, and that life is random and chaotic, and none of us really like that thought. Gosh, Catherine, you've been through it yourself a bit, I imagine, in the weeks.
Well, it takes up your headspace.
Yes, I got a message this morning of someone called Sue asking what I do to separate yourself from the news sometimes. I think referring more to the political spectrum, the political landscape, than this issue. Catherine, thank you. I know that wouldn't have been an easy call to make, but I wish you all the very best. And what you've reminded us of is humanity, actually. And the killer's father demonstrated great humanity to you. And at the moment, no one except you, as far as I'm aware, is demonstrating much humanity to him. It's 10:42. Peter's on the Wirral. Peter, what would you like to say?
James, that was a great, not a great call, but a really touching call, the last one. James, this is a subject my wife and I were talking about yesterday, to be honest, the concept of evil.
Yes.
And I think as a race, as a human race, or a part of the animal kingdom, it's something that we have developed to put an umbrella up when we don't understand. And I think you've highlighted a few points on this as you've gone along. We're probably the only species that does what this person does.
That's not true. I've been picked up for that, oddly. I thought it was a relatively innocuous comment about not many animals kill for fun, but actually quite a lot of animals do kill for fun.
But normally, I think I know where that person's going, and if you listen to, and I do watch a lot of natural, normally the only time animals kill is for protection, food, family.
You should meet my
territory.
cats.
Yeah. Or, cats are practicing. They're practicing hunting.
Okay. No, all right. So you can give it a rational basis. I don't know whether we're getting distracted here. Let you get back to your central point.
but the central point is we as a humanity, because we're thinking agents, we can't, and I think religion plays a part in this. Is we can't sort of accept that, and as one of your previous callers who worked in the secure mental health alluded to, that it is innate in all of us, but some of us can control it, and we don't want to think that. We don't want to look at each other and think, could they do that?
But that's how Holocausts happen, isn't it?
It is, and it was a brilliant BBC documentary, I think, The Rise of the Nazis.
Yeah.
And the part of that that got me was when they explained about the villages in Ukraine, where they pretty much started, and they got ordinary people. And I experienced something similar to this in Northern Ireland when I was a soldier there in the 70s, where people could go out on a Saturday night and throw petrol bombs and sticks. We knew each other. I was there for 6 months. We knew each other. But on Sunday mornings, when they were going to church, going to the shop or whatever, still on patrol, I would pass them and they'd look away from me. But on Saturday night, they wanted to hurt me.
Yeah.
But on Sunday morning, their brain could go,
I'm off to church now.
I don't want to hurt you now.
That's a good point.
And we have a difficulty as a humanity in saying, let's just not accept it, but understand it, that it can happen. And we can move on then from there, can't we? We can move on if we understand things better.
Well, there's certainly no way that you can work to prevent those things from happening more or happening again without making some efforts at understanding, although, of course, it can sometimes seem like a tightrope between explanation and excuse, but there will be events, and this is pretty close to one of them for me, that are beyond all rational analysis, except for that online element, except for that exposure that is unique to our age, to endless reams of hideous footage. People get addicted to it. People get addicted to violent pornography. That this is a pornography of a non-sexual nature, watching hideous things and becoming first desensitized to it and then perhaps excited by it. I don't know. And that's new, but that's an explanation. That's what Peter's saying. That speaks to the idea that something inside us, not just him, can be fed by external stimuli. So it's probably not the worst idea in the world to start having a proper think and proper look about the external stimuli. 10:46 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Conversation about evil and but what it is really, and of course alongside what it is, whether it exists. So 345 6060 973 is the number you need. 10:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Extraordinary call from Catherine, and now an extraordinary text from Christina, who writes, I hope Catherine does contact the killer's father. He will be reeling from this. My brother is a convicted double murderer. And every time I hear of these types of awful crimes, it makes me wonder whether I could have made a difference to his criminality. It's a very isolating feeling, as I feel a sense of being a victim simply by nature of being related to him. I'm a hard-working community and youth work postgraduate who has attempted to make a difference in the lives of others, and to that end I couldn't be more different from my brother. If we're to accept a society where evil exists, I think we also need to acknowledge that so do humanity and compassion for others. And Andy makes the point that the word evil was constructed by many religions to attempt to reduce the amount of people doing evil. I'm not religious, but I accept that religion can sometimes do good. That's a point, isn't it, worth considering? I mean, do we believe in the existence of virtue? Do we believe in the existence of goodness? Will you send me text telling me that talking about goodness is an oversimplification when we're describing acts of altruism or acts of charity? Because everything has an opposite, doesn't it? And if we accept the existence of good, then we must accept, I think, the existence of evil. Elise asks, where is redemption in all of this? Some people are capable of change. You're absolutely right. And on a completely different topic, you remind me of a a so-called MAGA grandmother in America, who I will tell you about later in the programme, who demonstrates that power, that ability to change. I don't think redemption is on the cards for this character socially, but morally, ethically. The idea that he'll wake up one day and feel absolute horror, shame and guilt at what he's done would be where redemption came into the picture. As things stand, that seems unlikely, doesn't it? Ian is in Dresden in Germany. Ian, what would you like to say?
How are you doing, James? First time I've managed to get through.
Welcome.
It's a bit of a heavy one, isn't it, today?
You can say that again. You can say that again.
Couple of points. First of all, something that came up, it's come up in the news in the past 24 hours. We've had a very similar situation in Aschaffenburg here in Germany. Yes. Where there was a stabbing in the park, and a young child died, and unfortunately it was a disturbed guy. And he was from Afghanistan originally. Right. And because we're in the middle of the political cycle at the moment, they've all jumped on it. And where I live in Meissen, close to Dresden. We're a kind of centre point for the AfD over here. Right. And many of the callers are bringing up Nazis. And we have them by the bucket load over here, I'm afraid, at the moment. And the point I wanted to bring up was the Hannah Arendt quote.
The banality of evil. That was in my mind as well, actually, oddly, just as you were speaking.
That's it. It's really, the people I know around here, lots of them came through the East German system. They were behind the Iron Curtain, and they were indoctrinated with the idea that they were victims of fascism. Their whole lives they were told they were victims of fascism too. So when the wall fell, it meant then that they didn't have any of that responsibility of what happened during the fascist period. And so they then have stayed here, and their frustrations have grown. And we've got to the point...
Slightly different phone-in from the one that we have. I mean, this guy, we're going to have this conversation next week, and we've had it earlier this week. But on the question of the existence of evil, where are you taking us?
Well, I'm taking this to the point of I work with people who are they're not evil in any shape or form or whatever. But what they do is they react when certain bad things happen. They react with that word evil, and that word evil, I think, has to be quantified and say, well, listen, we're all capable of this. It's banal. It's basically in us all. If you have the right circumstances, we end up being shaved monkeys.
We're not, Red. We can't. It's I mean, you can take that, but it's not something many people can swallow, is it? And you can understand why. And yet it denies the reality of history. There's a difference between going along with a tidal wave of horror and undertaking. I don't believe that we are all capable of doing what this man has done, but I do believe that, well, history teaches us that most people will either, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, join in with horrors when they happen.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah. And this, I think the Peter, I think it was Peter from Liverpool who was on before.
In the Wirral, yeah.
He was talking about this idea of, it's more a kind of construct that we have to try and see the good when we can, and try and get, and if there's a yin and yang involved, if there's evil,
you can't have one without the other. I'd only clocked that just before you came on. Is that we can have philosophical conversations about the existence of evil, but we don't have them about the existence of good. No one ever really questioned, apart from, I suppose, people who believe that everything is preordained or predetermined. But the rest of us are kind of very comfortable with the concept of good and slightly less comfortable with the concept of evil. A few therapists in touch today. Barbara, I think, puts the point many of them are making best. As a therapist, I wouldn't ignore the fact that the parents have come from Rwanda, a country of horrendous genocide. I'd look at transgenerational trauma and whether the horror had been unconsciously transmitted through the generations, this horrific act being an expression of what has been repressed. And it doesn't change that question, though, of why all the other people who have been through similar trauma or similar levels of repression don't behave in the way that he has done. He certainly had a fascination with genocide, which may have been born from his family's history, but he also had a fascination with serial killers, with Colonel Gaddafi, with the IRA. It's why the usual chancers claiming that suggestions it was terror-related somehow have been borne out are swinging the lead once again. You might as well say it was Colonel Gaddafi-related. You might as well say it was IRA-related. So they found the Al-Qaeda manual in his bedroom, but the reason why Prevent didn't investigate him after he was referred for a variety of reasons on 3 separate occasions was precisely because there was no evidence of terrorist ideology. If there had been, the chances are they'd have done a better job of reining him in, or at least trying to rein him in. So, the idea that the killings were terror-related is the latest lie from the people who were keen to use this hideous crime almost from the moment we first heard of it to further their own political aims. That shouldn't need explaining. It really shouldn't. But there's even a piece in the Times today suggesting that Farage deserves an apology, which is, even by the standards of the Times, which we've documented very accurately in recent years, is swirling down the toilet at an incredible speed. And it's only one column of commentary from one writer who's not on the staff of the newspaper. But goodness me, did they listen to what the judge said yesterday? Did they listen to what Mark Rowley said this morning? Absolutely extraordinary. And of course not extraordinary, because we're talking about a brand of politics that can lie about elections. So they can really lie about anything. 10:57 is the time. John's in Bloxwich. John, what would you like to say?
How you doing?
I'm all right, mate. Thank you. What's on your mind?
Yeah, just to attempt to answer your question, does evil exist? I think, without straying too far, but I mean, I suppose you have to define what evil is in the first place for it to exist, don't you? To some degree.
Yes. Yes, you do. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Go on, then.
And I don't think evil is a thing in itself. I think it's purely an absence of something. So I think your previous couple of callers back nailed something in terms of we do have all this kind of primordial, monkey-like nature from whence we came, but yes, we do have something different to all other animals. We have, and again, without putting too many labels on it, but whether it's a higher self, your consciousness,
yes, of course,
your spirit, your soul. So, but we have both at the same time. And when, going back to the religious texts, when they say we're all born sinners, what that just means is what sinning is, it's just purely absence of your higher self. So if you're doing something, less extreme than what this fella's did, but when you're about to do something which you kind of sort of know you shouldn't do, even down to if you're on a diet and you go to get the chocolate out of the fridge, there's almost something that kicks in which says, look, you shouldn't really be doing this. So all sinning is absence of that presence. But is
I said that's a really interesting analysis. But they're not like exceptions. I mean, we all react.
There's levels, though, aren't there?
Yeah, and you see this on a graph, because I'm still, after an hour of talking about it and a week, months of thinking about it at various points, not endlessly, obviously. I think comfort is the closest word I can get to how I feel when I think this is an absolute aberration. This isn't part of a broader norm. This isn't a point on a graph. This is an evil man who if we were ever to contemplate the return of the death penalty, it would be for cases like this.
Yeah.
It's beyond comprehension, even though we've spent an hour.
I think the scary thing is, though, the scary thing is about it, there's no limits in either side. There's no ceiling, top or bottom, to how good or how bad somebody can be. We all start at a certain level. But, I mean, this guy doesn't go from, just having a normal day at school to suddenly doing this.
No,
it's a slow sliding scale, and there isn't a bottom level to that. That can keep going darker and darker, and that's the scary thing about it.
And that leads us to the online question, doesn't it, of what that does, that
doesn't help.
Crucible does.
That accelerates it. It accelerates it a massive way. Yeah, so if you're already that way inclined and you've been kind of desensitized to a degree, and then all you're doing is just fuddling more and more of that into it, and then thought by thought you start to manipulate yourself and just fall further and further away from the potentially where you can be as a good person. There's no depth to how dark you can go, I don't believe.
Well, we know that to be true, because of what we've witnessed, not just in this case, but I suppose with crimes against humanity itself, as opposed to just against humans. 11:01 is the time. Thank you, John. Extraordinary calls, as you'd expect on this programme, but I never take anything for granted. I want to make that absolutely clear. Staying in similar territory, I think, and possibly opening up the conversation to this notion of isolation and what can grow in the darkness, and how widespread it is. How many young men, because it is usually men, are festering in a sort of swamp of their own online creations, and what the hell the rest of us can do about it. It's 11:01.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 11, just for the avoidance of doubt, explaining why this is not a terror-related incident is simply a matter of understanding the law. That they can change the law. I think Keir Starmer sort of mooted the notion of changing the law, because I'm terrorised by this incident. Ed Davey, I think the only political leader who mentioned his own parenthood as being a factor in his response. Really well-measured contribution from Ed Davey yesterday, which didn't get any coverage as far as I could tell. But you can change the law to include acts of epic violence undertaken for no ideological or motive-based reason whatsoever. I don't know how helpful it would be, but it's not a conversation I'm really qualified to have. Of course, people even less qualified than me will be seeking to dominate the discourse of that kind of conversation. But it's one area where it's probably worth listening to Keir Starmer with his experience as Director of Public Prosecutions. I mean, really, really, really bad murder becomes terrorism. And then where does that leave acts and atrocities that are undertaken in the pursuit of a political goal or in the belief that you'll receive your reward in heaven? I don't know. I want to talk briefly about another 17-year-old, this one who opened fire, I think I have to say allegedly, on Wednesday in the cafeteria at a high school in Nashville, killing a 16-year-old schoolmate. He then died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. A motive is not known, but the suspected killer left a substantial body of data online and on social media. So he, like the Southport killer, had a fascination with school shooters. His Pinterest account featuring various photographs of shooters from Parkland in Florida and Uvalde in Texas. He's also been shown to have been in contact with a 15-year-old girl who opened fire at a school in Wisconsin last month. And there is also evidence on his social media and on documents that the police have subsequently come across that he had a fascination with Adolf Hitler, and that despite himself being either black or mixed race, he was a white supremacist. He expressed self-hatred as a black person and wrote of wishing violence on other black people. He expressed violent hatred towards Jews and used anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories to express his views. He appeared to support neo-Nazi, accelerationist and violent incel beliefs and expressed a desire to see genocide committed against racial and religious minorities. But he also spent a huge amount of time alone and online, which is an increasingly common phenomenon. It's not new. This was something I thought that Starmer, I wouldn't say Starmer necessarily got it wrong, because it's probably new to most of us, but in the context of criminality and documenting such matters, it's not new. The online loner who sort of self-radicalizes before embarking on hideous campaigns of violence and carnage is not a new phenomenon. I mean, the school shooters are often found to have been self-radicalized online. And I use the word self-radicalized because it doesn't involve much human interaction. There might be some, I don't know, but it doesn't involve attending meetings, in the back room of a pub or in the back room of a mosque or in the back room of a church. It doesn't involve a kind of indoctrination from another human being. It involves a bizarre and, I think, uniquely modern relationship with online material. At risk of trying to knit too much together under one umbrella. I do think we need to be really, really conscious of what governments are trying to do to the platforms that host this material, and why some of the owners of these platforms, like Elon Musk, have such a profound problem with some governments. You know, Nazi salutes aside, the simple commercial imperative of wanting a government in place that isn't going to make you sacrifice profits and spend money in the removal of hideous content from the internet. Getting governments that won't make you do that into power would have a huge commercial motive for anybody who owns these platforms. And look at how all the owners of all of the platforms are now bending the knee for Donald Trump, seated in front of his cabinet, of course, at the inauguration address. So Scott suggests the issue isn't that he's online, the issue is that he's alone. I disagree with you on that, actually. I think the issue is clearly that he's online. If he was alone and not online, he wouldn't be exposed to the material that he's exposed to. But it's not online per se. If he spent his life playing the new Indiana Jones game or the games that Elon Musk has lied about being brilliant at, he'd have a desiccated existence, but he wouldn't be radicalizing himself, for want of a better word, into becoming, I say they, both of these people, one developed almost like an excited passion for epic violence, and the other stumbled across an ideology. The other stumbled across white supremacism and great replacement theory and anti-Semitism, and he undertook violence in order to make a point about the things that he believes, like the terror attack in Germany over Christmas, which was undertaken to protest against the number of Muslims coming in to Germany. But that online process, and I'm going to say something now that is simultaneously obvious and terrifying, and I don't know if it would have occurred to you before. It probably has, but if it hasn't, you're going to be shocked by the banality of it, because that could happen to anybody. Every single person listening to this program has access to the material that radicalized both of these 17-year-olds, turning them both into murderers, one a terrorist and one a criminal of a kind that we can't really categorize, because he feels like more than a mere murderer. And yet, without any ideology or without any motivation that is born of a belief system, he's not, under current British law, a terrorist. But every single person, every single 17-year-old in this country could have, with the click of a mouse, an uninterrupted screed of imagery and literature in front of them that has, in these two cases, played a crucial role in the corruption of their minds. I mean, that takes us back to the question of evil and whether or not there's something there before corruption occurs. But you see what I mean. 13 minutes after 11 is the time, and the question is, Dave says, just lighten up a bit, James, will you, and give us an Indiana Jones game review. I will this hour. I haven't done a video game review in years because I haven't really managed to get stuck into one except football, and I've got stuck into the new Indiana Jones games on the Xbox, so I will give you a little review of that later, but not yet, because here is a crucial question. I don't know who can answer this, either from a personal or a professional perspective. What are the signs? Because everybody's online. And teenage boys in particular have a long and inglorious history of spending an awful lot of time locked up in their bedrooms, shut up in their bedrooms. Don't we? We did. Most kids. With me, it was a ZX Spectrum. Didn't have the internet. But what are the signs of danger? And if you've come out the other end of a rabbit hole, I'd be particularly interested in hearing from you. Most of us use the word algorithm without really understanding what it means, you know. The idea, if you haven't actually witnessed it or being exposed to it, the idea that your diet of input, your diet of stimuli, is being very carefully curated by a computer program. And if you spend more time watching something because you're transfixed by the horror of it, then you will get more similarly horrible stuff fed directly into your feed, fed directly into your technology. So I went through a phase of being inappropriately drawn to footage of people falling over. And it took me a while to understand why my Facebook feed was suddenly offering me endless footage of people falling over or just sort of clumsy, funny clumsiness. But if I had happened upon footage of atrocities, footage of war crimes, footage of genocide, it's all out there. CCTV footage of hideous crimes. And that is what had paused me, if you like. That had stuck me in front of the screen goggle-eyed. It would fill up with that. And if, God forbid, I had an interest in it and started looking for it, it would bring more and more to my attention. Well, because you like this, you like that. Andy wonders who radicalised Anders Breivik. Anders Breivik is one of the people that has popped up in the Nashville killers manifesto or records. We often forget about him, don't we? And indeed some of the household name British journalists that appeared in his account of why he'd undertaken mass murder of children. But what are the signs? What should we be looking for? 0345 6060973. So if you've come out the other side of the rabbit hole, you can tell parents listening to this when they should be concerned. You presume your 15-year-old is shut up in their room watching porn. You might be worried about the type of porn that they're watching, or playing video games. You might be not so much these days. That ship seems to have sailed, worried about the type of video games that they're playing or listening to their music. But if they are going down a rabbit hole of self-radicalization, how would you know? How would you know that something dodgy was going on? And I don't mean by checking their history, their internet search history, partly because not every parent would know how to do that, and partly because the average teenager who suspected that their parents were doing that would soon wipe the evidence. I mean more in the behaviour. There's a picture of the Southport killer's living room where he was living. There's no earthly way his parents didn't know that he was deeply, deeply troubled, disturbed, sick, call it what you will, to the point where the father was begging the taxi driver a week before not to drive him to his school, in a bit of detail I didn't get until yesterday, begging the taxi company to stop sending cars, saying don't send any drivers to this house. It kind of had him under a form of sort of house arrest, although it failed on the day of the killings. But the picture of the room he was living in speaks of a chaotic mind, not necessarily a murderous one. But what should we be looking for? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. I just know that every teenager potentially can find online the stuff that these two killers found. And even if you find it, even if you immerse yourself in it, the massive majority of kids are not going to end up being murderers, but it's not going to be doing them any good, even if they don't end up being murderers. So how do you know if the teenager in your life is leading an online life that is dangerous, as opposed to just typically teenage grubbiness? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's 11:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 11 is the time. Kosso tells me when it comes to social media algorithms, TikTok has been long considered to be so good it's been described as weapons grade. Many US companies have tried to get their hands on it for years. That may be relevant, Kosso suggests, to the recent hullabaloo regarding TikTok, which I haven't fully followed. I thought Donald Trump was calling for TikTok to be banned, and then doing a lap of honour for unbanning it, as it were, or removing the threat of a ban and saying that we'll just take half of it. Hey, nice business you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And Elon Musk now being cited as someone who might buy. I don't know enough about it, but I do know this. A friend of mine who works in the field went on TikTok about 5 years ago and just actually phoned me. He's not with us anymore, sadly. But he phoned me and said, this is absolutely insane. This is crack cocaine. He said, I do this. I make content for a living. And this something in this algorithm has just pulled me in like a fish on a hook. So that 2 hours later, I suddenly realised that I'd disappeared down a rabbit hole. And we didn't have a conversation about the technological capacities that had allowed that to happen. But it's the equivalent. And what if the rabbit hole is full of hideous images and footage of hideous crimes? Or, of course, the vile racist rhetoric, white supremacism and great replacement theory and Islamophobia and xenophobia. And yet with that, we talked earlier in the week with Dr. Nafis about the pseudo-academic background for eugenics and white supremacism, which, of course, takes us right back to the Nazis. So how can you tell if the teenager in your life is in danger? Beth's in Hammersmith. Beth, what would you like to say?
James, really, I'm a blast from the past. I'm now retired, but I worked in child psychiatry. And the thing that I regret the most is that this country got rid of child guidance. Child guidance was a network of local authority-funded services, multidisciplinary services, and they put the whole thing into the NHS, where, of course, the child services have to compete with all the other services in the NHS. And this happened in the Thatcher era, and it's a terrible thing. The parents, families have no help because they have to join a queue.
Okay.
It's an unequal battle, and really we should reinstitute child guidance. That I don't know what these parents can do. They have to have a port of call where professionals can identify the danger signs. I don't think the parents are up to it.
Well, crikey. Well, I suppose the parents would have to know enough to want to invite the attentions of an organisation, because the list of missed opportunities, to go back to the Southport killer we were talking about in the first hour, and who we're still talking about now, obviously, albeit from a different angle, the list of missed opportunities is long. There's lots of agencies that could and arguably should have got involved, but you're suggesting that the one that was needed doesn't exist anymore.
Correct.
Gosh, I hadn't thought of that. And what would that have looked like? That would have been psychiatric in its impulse, rather than
psychologists.
So here is a child. Here is a teenager showing an extraordinary level of interest and excitement in violence.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually trigger the prevent threshold for taking action. It doesn't trigger the social services threshold but it should have triggered a mental health threshold for triggering violence. And where would it come under now? CAMS.
Yes, and CAMS,
Right.
as you know, can't cope with the queues of children they're expected to see.
I presume that the proliferation of online content wasn't a major factor when you were practicing. Well, it depends when you retired, Beth, doesn't it, really?
Yeah.
But you didn't deal with that, because that's a different beast, isn't it?
It's a completely new beast, but what it does, it goes straight into the imagination. And if we accept that there is a diseased imagination, it will be fed by all the dross that's out there online.
What's a diseased imagination?
A diseased imagination would be one which isn't tempered by ordinary life, by normality.
So the isolation escalates then? Online and alone are inseparable?
Correct. They participate in a collective, whatever it is. It could be good or it could be bad. It could be religion, or it could be military, or it could be porn, any number of things. So what's happened is that the individual mind has got weaponized, and it's got a direct access to the collective stuff that's out there. And it is not mitigated by anything else.
By reality.
Exactly.
Or by shared reality, by humanity.
Shared reality, by humanity.
What should people look for then? Because I had a bit of a crash course in some of the newer breed of video games that people actually spend. I remember a story a few years ago about a cafe in Korea where a fellow was wearing a nappy so that he didn't have to leave the screen. He was putting so many hours into playing these games. I didn't realise how commonplace that was until I was reading about Elon Musk telling fibs about how good he is at these games. So if a teenager is spending 23 hours a day playing a video game, he's not leading a very healthy life, but he is not necessarily, he's not going to turn up at a dance class in Southport and start stabbing little girls. How do you know if that alone and online is is veering into dangerous as opposed to unhealthy, profoundly unhealthy?
You don't know. I would imagine that family would have adapted to the increasing craziness among them.
Well, they clearly did because of you can see the photographs of the room that he was in. So they knew something was profoundly wrong. They weren't 100% sure what, and were presumably praying, literally, given their background, that it wouldn't end in the way that it did.
Yes, and they had nowhere to turn to.
No.
And the people who were around them who might have helped couldn't recognize it for what it was. So you've got a dreadful combination of the state letting down families and families who are at sea who don't know how to help their children.
Yes, who don't know how to help their children. That was a conversation we had earlier in the week about whether or not anything else could actually have happened. And Keir Starmer talks a lot about state failings, but to pinpoint precisely which elements of the state failed may not be possible, because as Beth attests, it's a failure of absence. He also said the thing about immigration and cuts, speaking to two potential lazy-ish lines of engagement on this. Like blaming it on immigration is obviously racist and dishonest. Blaming it on cuts is potentially unhelpful unless it's true. So I was slightly surprised he threw that into the mix. If the systems that could have helped are not there, then that would be at least an explanation, if not an excuse, as to why he was not helped. But that list of missed opportunities include a Childline, a referral to the police from Childline, referrals to Prevent in the first case because he was demonstrating a fascination in his school with mass shootings, and he was undertaking online searches with regard to mass shootings. The second referral to Prevent was over pictures uploaded to Instagram of Colonel Gaddafi. The third referral to Prevent was demonstrating a similar level of fascination with the London Bridge terror attacks. But on all occasions, Prevent declined to continue with his case because there was no evidence of extremism. Extreme violence is not extremism ideologically, but its extreme psychiatric concern triggers nothing in this whole process, nothing medical, ever. Father asks for assistance in May of 2022. But from who? It's coming up to 11:30. Thank you for that, Beth. Let me now steer you back to that question of what we should be looking for. The notion that... Well, have a listen to this, actually, because this is Mark Rowley speaking to Nick Ferrari earlier today. This is what prompted my question, actually. It popped into my mind while I was listening to this.
If you're lost in your bedroom and you're grazing on a diet of, American school shooting materials, ISIS beheadings, extreme right-wing propaganda, there's material out there that give you tactics for use of knives and building explosives.
It's in this.
It's horrific.
It is horrific. This is ghastly.
And
this is chilling.
And that shouldn't be in kids' bedrooms, but it is.
I don't know if you heard Nick also showing the Commissioner of the Met how easy one of our colleagues here found it to access all of this stuff online, up to and including terrorism manuals. I don't think anyone would call Nick Ferrari's show terror-related this morning, just because it was in possession of the kind of document that the Southport killer was able to get hold of. But it's pertinent because it shows how easy it is to get access to this material. But that phrase there, grazing on this kind of diet. So it's not about being shut up in your room online, because there's lots of things you could be doing. But if you're doing this sort of thing, how do the other people in the house know? What should they be looking for? It's 11:30. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I've thought a few times, I don't know whether you have, I vaguely remembered the story, but Eleanor reminded me of it earlier this week. There are 140 Facebook moderators who were working online in Kenya. Outsourced, what's it called? Not just online, there's another word. Remote working in Kenya, being diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and various other conditions because of the exposure to graphic social media content, including murders, suicides, child sexual abuse and terrorism. So if the professionals can be traumatized in this way, can end up ill, effectively. Various disorders, major depressive disorder, generalised anxiety disorder. The Southport killer, oddly, was confined to his house, by all accounts, as a consequence of his anxiety. In fact, the last referral from any authority came from the school he was supposed to be attending, but he hadn't attended since May 2022. So in March 2023, a member of staff at the high school in Southport he was signed up at requested a welfare check. But because he'd been seen by CAMS the previous January, it was decided that it wasn't necessary to visit him. So he'd completely isolated himself and fed on a diet that the paid professional moderators on Facebook were diagnosed with PTSD, depression and anxiety as a direct consequence of having been exposed to it for 8 to 10 hours a day as a job at a facility in Kenya. You can't tell me that that's not pertinent to the conversation that we're having. So what should people be looking for? Grace is in Stafford. Grace, what would you like to say?
I think people should be looking for signs very early on. And I think, although the knowledge is there now, and I'm talking about Great Ormond Street, actually.
Okay.
So, they have it's all to do with different brains.
Yes. Well, it's not all to do with that, but it does seem to play a part.
Yes. Well, I think that's how it starts.
Yes.
So this young person in my life, who I feel is now, well, it is very much at a crossroads because, between coming to the end of primary school, from which he has just recently been excluded,
right,
and going to secondary school, and has only recently been diagnosed when he should have been diagnosed at a very young age.
Well, there's a limit on how much diagnosis you can do at a very young age because faculties and brains are still forming.
Yes, but actually there isn't. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but it's just that the knowledge that is there hasn't yet been disseminated across the teaching profession as it needs to be.
Well, this is long before the online isolation begins. You're talking about a 10-year-old. There's no reason why they shouldn't be online, but they're not going to be doing 14 or 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, are they?
Well, he is online, and I'm sure if his father and mother were not sort of totally up to speed with the internet and controlling everything, he would be. But fortunately, it's very what he sees is very controlled and actually quite childlike. But going back to the early days,
yes,
because he's actually now finally being diagnosed as dyslexic, dyscalculic, and autistic as well. All quite mouthfuls for people to hear, let alone sort of get their heads around what it means. Is starting. I mean, even as a baby, very feisty, sitting on the change mat, shooting his arm out.
But there are loads. I mean, I do need to remind. I know you know this, but people listening would expect me to point out at this point there are lots of dyslexic, dyscalculic and autistic people who do not have any more proclivity for violence or unpleasantness than anybody else does.
Oh, well, absolutely. And that's why we're hoping to get him into the right sort of next school. And I have to say the school that he's in at the moment, or was, is extremely good for children that don't have problems. Other children in the family are absolutely fine. It's the fact that these problems, I should say, were not picked up at an early age.
Well, because I thought, I didn't know that the knowledge was there. It just wasn't being disseminated. Yeah. I very much was under the impression that you can't make diagnoses earlier. In fact, it's actively discouraged. And of course, many parents won't want them earlier because they worry about stigma and labelling.
No, that's absolutely not. That's absolutely not the case. If it is picked up, as I say, he's considered to be high functional, so he's superb at art. Anything that's sort of visual, graphic, anything, superb at that. But it's not just reading and writing. It's listening. It's hearing what people say and misinterpreting it. And being very feisty from which many babies are. I'm not saying
exactly.
that they're not. Many babies are very feisty, but it's the way you handle it. I'm sorry, I feel I'm not making it very clear, really, but I think when he went in...
That's all right. It's quite an odd environment, phoning up a radio station, Grace. But I understand some of what you're saying.
It's difficult to put it all into words.
Well, welcome to my world.
When he first went into school, I think it was appreciated that it wasn't a case of the fact that he was just being naughty. It was appreciated that, in fact, he did have...
It's choice, it's consciousness. Yes, I hear you. Because I've got children in my life, young children in my life who are autistic, and sometimes we have to explain to others, including other family members, their own family members, that they can't help this. Elements of this behaviour. They don't respond to the social cues and the quotes normal end quotes behaviour in the way that we do. But I don't know how pertinent that is, and I accept the pressure of this kind of format can sometimes be quite unhelpful. But I don't know how pertinent all of this is to the specific question of what you do if your teenager is terminally online and alone. And some of the things they could be doing are not a cause for major concern. It's not an ideal lifestyle. But these two 17-year-olds that we're talking about today on both sides of the Atlantic, what could have been or should have been spotted? I mean, in the case of the Southport killer, I suspect the parents were well aware of the problems. 4 times they tried to get the police involved. CAMS were actually on the case. What is the agency that dropped the ball here? Prevent is... constituted to deal with extremism, not with extreme violence, which is what this character's fascination was with. I welcome that inquiry, and I think it was the right decision of Keir Starmer to call it absolutely immediately. But it could conclude that the systemic failure was a failure of absence, as Beth in Hammersmith suggested earlier. It was a failure caused by there not being a port of call that could have intervened, because every port of call that could have intervened was consulted, as far as I can tell. Thank you, Grace. Andy's in Shrewsbury. Andy, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I was listening to you while I was in the car. It's a privilege to be on, mate. I run a company that trains professionals in county lines, child sexual exploitation and internet safety for children. Right. And in that session, and I train social workers, police officers, residential staff, foster carers. And,
do we have enough Andys in the country?
No, we don't.
No,
we don't.
I thought you might say.
Lot of mileage. But in that session, we actually accessed very easy to access websites and apps. And I can promise you that people are sitting there with their mouths agog, and they are parents and they are professionals. Nobody understands the easiness of accessing these things. So you can say Axel Rudabakana is a loner, but he's not alone when he's got this world living in his head. And it's exactly the same for Lewis Danes, who killed Brett Bednar, and he's talking to children on gaming apps, but he's watching beheadings. And we don't talk enough about desensitization. And I've said this to your producer. Yes. The Children's Act, which is the legal act designed to protect children in this country, was published in 1989.
Before the internet existed in its current...
That's 36 years ago. It was updated in 2004, not to be too depressing.
Well, no, it was...
in 2004, which is 21 years ago.
So it was written when the most advanced technology you'd find in a teenager's bedroom was a Commodore 64.
Exactly. The point I'm trying to make is you won't find TikTok in the Children's Act.
Gosh.
You won't find Facebook in so nobody has to do anything. So what we're doing, James, is, if it's okay to say, we are batting away the issue until something serious happens.
Well, now something serious has happened, and people are already embarking on batting away the issue.
Yes.
People are doing... How do you get into what you do?
I actually ran children's homes for 17 years. Right. And I ran crisis homes, intervention homes, and I actually ran the first child sexual exploitation residential home in the UK.
Gosh.
But I'll be honest, James, I banned the internet in my homes.
I bet you did.
Because I could see
You couldn't do that now, though, could you, with phones and things?
You can do what you like if it's your policy.
Can you?
But social workers will tell you can't because they haven't been trained like I train.
When and why did your alarm bells start ringing? between 1989 and now, at some point you realised that for all the great work you've done over the years, the single most important thing you could dedicate your working life to would be the threats that we're talking about today.
I think I was think about this, James. We are the last generation to remember the world without the internet, and that will never happen again.
I know.
And I saw the rise of the internet, and I saw particularly girls, because I work with girls in the CSE homes, becoming incredibly excited by these little devices and what people were saying to them on them. And we were losing girls. We were, you know what, we don't need to go over the CSE, all of that again. But I saw the danger.
I spoke to someone who ran a children's home going back 10 years or so, when we were talking about the grooming gangs that no one has talked about before, according to Elon Musk. And he described to me something you'll appreciate: the impossibility of stopping someone from going out. A 15-year-old girl climbing down the fire escape to meet up with her abusers.
Yeah, there's very specific laws. Yeah. The abuser would have to be on the drive to prevent her going out, because you could see the immediate danger. But what worries me now, James, is, I don't know if you saw I'm sure you're all over this, Donald Trump stated yesterday he wouldn't be against Elon Musk buying TikTok.
Yeah.
So we will have the same man running the two main threats that I see, X and TikTok. He's also lifted freedom of speech. I mean, I don't know where we're heading.
No, well, and if adults are worried, God knows, as you say, when parents find out what their children... Then that phrase there, out of all the things you've just said to me, playing a video game while watching beheadings, or chatting online with fellow gamers while watching beheadings.
Yeah.
And that... So what would you say? This is probably a slightly glib question for somebody with your level of expertise, but if I had a 15-year-old boy at home who never left his room, what would I be looking for as evidence of the serious stuff to worry about, as opposed to the sad stuff?
You would absolutely be looking for, do you know, shockingly, you would absolutely be looking for the impact of trauma. And we don't talk about that enough. So
as in, he is being traumatised by what he has watched.
He is being traumatized. They are all being bombarded by algorithms. If you put self-harm into Twitter, you'll be bombarded with emails, messages, invites to chat boxes. Trauma is what I'm talking about. Numbness, desensitization. So for your children, for anybody listening, watch for quietness, isolation. James, this will shock you.
Go on.
We advise no phone zones, which is an hour off your phone every night, where we talk about your day.
No, we do that. Why would that shock me? We do that, or we try.
People just laugh at me. Getting the phone off my child for an hour at night. Are you crazy? And it's just frightening.
I see, and it's energy as well. I mean, it's a big. Parents have to sort of, gird their loins, as it were, and deal with the fight. And I think this generation of parents, my generation of parents, are reluctant to engage in the scrap sometimes, and so they just leave the phone with the child.
Oddly, we call it parenting by device.
Parenting by device. Oddly, I mentioned earlier Sue getting in touch to ask about how I deal with some of the horrible businesses that we have to deal with professionally. And I'll just read you what I replied. She said, I just wondered what you do to switch off. And I said, I read a lot, watch daft TV and movies, go to the theatre and play video games for escapism, but I frequently remind myself to stay off social media and avoid the news for decent lengths of time, especially at the weekend. Yeah. And that's me at 52 who does it for a living.
So tell that to a 13-year-old.
Yeah. And how pointless are all of these conversations if nothing is being done to prevent the platforms from proliferating this kind of content?
Yeah, so last point, James.
Yes.
I had high hopes for this new government. It hasn't worked out at the moment. But I think we worry about how we look rather than what we can do.
Okay, so the online safety bill is causing concern in some quarters, but you're not convinced that it's going to do it.
The online safety bill just makes me laugh.
Oh dear!
Because by the time it's in place, it's like let's put it like this, James, and then I'll go.
Go on.
The internet is like a space rocket going at 200 million miles an hour, and our laws are like my grandmother on a bike trying to catch it up.
That's a lovely image. I like your analogies. Just stay on the line, will you, Andy, and give a bit more detail to Eleanor, because I can imagine many circumstances in which we'd want to talk to you on a more formal footing. No guarantee, given how busy you are, that you'll actually be listening organically on the next time that we turn our attention to this kind of thing. I'd love to find out more about what you do. It sounds incredibly It sounds incredibly important. I think everyone can agree about that. There you go. I have been on this guy's courses. He's a very knowledgeable and superb trainer, but there aren't enough of them. And Andy scoffed, understandably, given his experiences, but what the hell chance have we got of stemming the tide if the people who profit from the tide are the most important people either in or adjacent to Donald Trump's administration? That's the question I began the week asking about the people sitting behind him at the inauguration and what chance Keir Starmer would have of curtailing their activities if the American government was committed to protecting their activities. I think that's going to be the most important question of the year in many ways. It's 10 to 12.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I wonder whether you remember the story I told you a few years ago about sitting on a bus when three little boys one of them had some pornography on his phone. And it just came back into my mind then when Andy was talking, because I told you at the time one of them was really apparently loving it and showing it to his two mates. One of them was kind of keen to get in on the action, as it were. And the third one, the one I remember, was dumbstruck by what he was looking at, by what his mate had just shown him. I don't know what it was. I could hear it, but I couldn't see it. But, I don't need to speculate unduly. But and they were about 11 or 12, I think, first year secondary school. And I've just thought then, when he talked about trauma, and that's just, one little moment, and you just think, how can you tell if your boy or your daughter, but it's more likely to be a son, is going to really dark places on the internet? What should you be looking for on the rare occasions when he leaves his room? 11:53 is the time. Joe's in Newham. Joe, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. There's quite a few things. I don't have television, so I don't see what you see, but I listen to LBC every night and every day. What I got the impression of when they said in court he was shouting and saying things, immediately I thought, that's a tantrum. He's showing a tantrum as if he's out of body experience. He's not really in his emotions. He's just thrown out the tantrum as if to say, leave me alone, leave me alone.
Yes.
Hence being removed. But the other thing was, obviously, in a family unit, if you're sitting down having family meals or time together, special times, then you get to know your children and their behavior, even if it's one child. And, for example, their favorite treat, if you give them that and they're reluctant to enjoy, get into, there's some underlying, their mannerism, their moods, things seem to be...
I was going to tease you a bit, Joe. I was going to suggest that if you haven't even got a telly, you're probably not the first person I talk to for advice on how to spot signs of online radicalisation. But I think you're suggesting that we may be talking about timeless processes that are not linked to technology, but you can tell when a child is going down a bad path, perhaps.
That's a part of it. And also when I go to the library, I see what these young kids play, these violent games, and they shout and carry on.
No, but we're not talking about them. I mean, that might be an entry or a gateway, but we're talking about people watching actual real beheadings.
Yes, exactly. Whatever you take into your system. That's not a game. Whatever you take in either hook you and you want more of it, if it's, good, bad or indifferent.
Yes.
But all the agencies, I used to work as a counsellor, and I used to work with Connections Young People's Service.
Yes.
And I actually diagnosed a young man with schizophrenia, and all social services gave him was a befriender to walk around with him every day. And he did violent crimes. And when I phoned them to tell them, they were like, who are you, blah, blah, blah. In the end, they did their own assessment and saw it was true, and they sectioned him. But the key point is all the agencies failed him. I am just saying he commit the crime, but they should have on their system.
That is what the inquiry is going to look at. But the more you look at this list of missed opportunities, the more you wonder whether there were missed opportunities at all, or whether the system actually doesn't have the engine, the space to deal with a person like this. Thank you, Joe. Stay safe. Some extraordinary polling undertaken by YouGov. I warn about the problems that are being fomented by certain characters more than perhaps anybody else does. Even I'm stunned how successful their campaigns of misinformation and racism and Islamophobia have been. Between a fifth and a quarter of Britons, this is according to polling YouGov has released today, 21 to 24% of Britons believe, I'm going to say his name for the first time today, that the Southport killer Axel Rudakabana is a Muslim, an immigrant to the UK, and that he was motivated by religious terrorism. The figure has actually gone up since the summer. 21 to 24% of Britons falsely believe the absolute untruths that the killer is a Muslim, is an immigrant, and was motivated by religious terrorism. I will leave you to speculate on what their news sources and or favourite politicians may look like. But that's why these warnings are important. Because people believe things that are not true. And when people believe things that are not true about demographics or populations or minorities, then they do terrible things. So there it is. 11:57 is the time. Last word on this from Ade, who's in Leighton. Ade, what would you like to say?
So I was just calling just to say that I believe everybody's got capability for good, for evil, for love, for hate, compassion, and so on. The difference between, I think, the computer generation now and the people who are not from the computer generation is that the society, because we all believe in this universal agreement that there's
like a social contract.
Yes, that we shouldn't kill and things like that. This is then carried out in law. So not only do you have it socially, but you also have it that is buttressed in law. It is buttressed in religion or some religion.
And then you get online and there's no structures or rules at all.
Exactly.
That's a really profound, I know it's obvious, but it's a really profound observation as well, because some of the stuff I don't understand about what's happening in America, like Donald Trump freeing the bloke who ran a massive online illegal drug trafficking, drug trading platform. It's as if they want to bring the Wild West values that you can find in the darkest corners of the internet into mainstream society.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not quite sure how to, how that can be combated or, but I do think also, just going back to your point about how can you notice this, sometimes I think one of the things I would say is don't let your children be alone.
You can't do that with a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old. They'll chase you out of their bedroom. I would have done when I was that age.
Exactly. But I think in this day and age, it's even more so now that we can't allow.
It's even more important to do it, and even more impossible. I'm cracking on only because of the time, Ade. I apologise if you feel you were cut off in your prime. I'm just reeling from this polling as well. So why and how? I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question. Can almost a quarter of the population believe 3 patently false things about the Southport killer? And why would other people in positions of influence want them to? Why would they want these lies to be believed? 21 to 24%. Incredible. Might be worth looking at the polling figures for political parties at the moment as well. You might see some reflections or close to reflections in those kind of numbers. Could be a coincidence, of course. Yeah, and if you think it is, I've got a bridge I want to sell you. It's 12 noon.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple of texts that came in surprisingly close together. The first from Paul, who writes, what a different conversation you are having compared to where I live in the US, where the media would be clamouring for the parents to be imprisoned. I'm trying to get the US turned on to Mr. James O.B. Well, good luck with that, Paul. But in the same space, just a few minutes later, Jamie saying, come on, James, this guy's an evil monster. A portion of the blame should be put on the parents here. There is no way they didn't know what this monster was doing in his bedroom. The taxpayer should not be paying money to keep this monster in segregation. Stick him in the general population and let him fend for himself. So, as I've said a few times in the past, all human life is here. To take up Paul's point briefly, it depends what question you ask. If you say, do you blame the parents, your switchboard could light up. Mostly people shouting yes, often also people explaining no. But if you ask what could they have done, it'd be a very different conversation. And that is, in a sense, the territory that we explore together on this programme. What? So, all right, here's your knee-jerk response. Yes, we all feel that. We felt it as soon as we heard this. Of course. And we want to believe that something could be done because it makes us feel safer. It makes us feel that that the fickle finger of fate will never point at us, that somehow human agency could prevent tragedy, could keep the chaos at bay. So you say, do you blame the parents? Yes, I do. So what could they have done differently? And you end up reading, with respect, Jamie, nonsense like they must have known what he was getting up to in his bedroom. But what could they do about that? They could stop him. They'd take away his internet. Or do you see what I mean? You end up circling the possibility that there's not a great deal in this hideous record, this hideous chronology, where intervention could have worked. And yet we all desperately want to believe that there is, because, of course, that minimises the likelihood of repetition. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. I think a complete change of pace. We could do a Brexit story, but I think we've done it already. Anger, apparently, as Number 10 opens the door to customs deal with Brussels. What a strange country we've become. Keir Starmer was accused of bending the knee. Yeah, by whom? I love these stories. It was probably Priti Patel. Yeah, bloody hell, it was. I should stop speculating like that before I've read the actual story. So, the trade damage done by Brexit remains absolutely immense, but there's anger at attempts to undo some of it. There's a story about the importance of recruiting therapists at GP surgeries in preference to prescriptions for antidepressants. That's really interesting, actually. So that's a contender for this hour, and so is the £90,000 payout for a pregnant hairdresser who was essentially demoted to cleaning and making tea after she said that she was pregnant. And I wasn't sure that this kind of thing still went on until I read this story. And I am drawn to the question of whether or not telling your employers that you're pregnant is still a hazardous business. I presume that it is. So it's a choice between those two stories this hour. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, doesn't James do this sort of thing off air? Doesn't he? Don't they have a chat about what they're supposed to be talking about next off air? We do, but I can't make my mind up sometimes until I get on it. So I'm torn. I'll just check with the team. Which one do you prefer, hairdresser or therapy? It's a bit like asking what you're doing this afternoon, isn't it? Hairdresser or therapy? Okay, Keith, any preference? No. Dan, any preference? Hairdressers or therapy? Dan is responsible for the new James O'Brien Daily podcast, so he'll have a slightly different editorial slant. This is the new 60-minute attempt. He's the one charged with cutting down 3 hours of undiluted genius into a 1 hour, relatively bite-sized podcast. So he's got the hardest job in the building. Imagine having to decide what the best bits are of this programme. It's best bits from beginning to end. Seriously, no wonder he looks so harried. I think I'll go in on the hairdressers one, but I'll keep the therapy in my back pocket for next week because I'm fascinated by this. I've never had medication. I've never been clinically depressed, thank goodness, but I've told you on several occasions that I think if everybody in the country had therapy, decent therapy, then the world would be an infinitely happier place. So is it still, or what happened? I just want to know, because in this case... Thank you, Davey. Davey says, we all love being part of the production meeting. So I should start paying more attention to what you say, actually. And Ben points out that I still haven't talked about the Indiana Jones game. Right, come back, Keith. When I come back from the 12:30 news, I'll do my Indiana Jones review, all right, for video game fans. First one I've really got stuck into in the longest time. But what I want to know is how you know that your employer is furious that you're pregnant. Kaylee Flanagan sued for discrimination after noticing a, quote, immediate change of attitude from her employer. She was removed from the online booking system. She was only therefore able to take walk-in customers, meaning that there was nothing else for her to do but clean the salon. How do you pronounce that word? I like salon as opposed to salon, but you're perfectly welcome to put the emphasis on the first syllable. And make the tea. And this all came, she was adamant, as a consequence of revealing that she was pregnant. Eventually, she resigned and sued her unfavourable and sued her former employer for unfavourable treatment due to pregnancy and therefore constructive dismissal. The fact that she's just been awarded £89,849 is probably testament to the fact that she had a fairly strong case. Not all of her claims were upheld, but the judges found, the employment judge, singular, found that her bosses had sought to find fault with her work and were no longer invested in her as a result of her pregnancy. I don't want to engage in any casual sexism, so I won't. But I did find myself particularly surprised that it was a female employer in a hair salon, which you would think would be a very feminine environment, where getting pregnant was something to be celebrated and shared in, as opposed to something to be effectively punished. That's the point here, and that's the word I'm using. Did you get punished for getting pregnant? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's one of those subjects that I like to bring an international lens to. I think I'm right in saying that I am living in a country that lags behind many of our European counterparts when it comes to the reaction to pregnancy in the workplace. But I don't have the qualifications, except a brief understanding of what happens in Denmark. I don't have the qualifications to make really meaningful comparisons. So you can, okay? You've told your employer in this country that you're pregnant, you got one sort of reaction. You've told your employer in another country that you're pregnant, you got another sort of reaction. John says, when my wife told her boss she was pregnant, he said, "Oh no." So we surmised he wasn't overjoyed. You correctly conclude that we are detectives. And Elise reminds me that not all women are feminists. And yet, if you're a small business owner running a business for women, largely by women, you probably would think of yourself as a feminist until one of your employees comes up to you and says, "Oh, I'm pregnant." And you respond in a really horrible way. Which leads me to the second question of the hour, which is why? And this might involve a little bit of enlightenment and empathy, actually. It might be that our system is constructed in such a way that having a member of staff go off on maternity leave is actually a huge pain in the proverbials for an employer, and it can actually damage the ability to run a business. And the smaller the business is, the more damage can be done. So should we have more sympathy for employers in this scenario? For the avoidance of doubt, the employment judge, also a woman, Louise Brown, categorically concluded that there was no justification whatsoever for what happened, but you may know differently from your world. So question number one, what happened when you told your boss you were pregnant? And obviously, we're not looking for calls saying, "Oh, they bought me a bunch of flowers and told me to go and put my feet up." Or are we? I think we're looking for negative reactions, aren't we, exclusively? Or is that a bit bleak? Is that pessimist? Should we look for positive reactions? I don't know. I think we need to find that. Otherwise, it's not a story, is it? It's dog bites man. I don't know. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, James, you should have these conversations with yourself off air. You shouldn't be doing this in the studio. We've also got to talk about the very important advice given out by one police officer, which all dog owners must be paying particularly special attention to. But I want to get stuck into this first. So did you tell your employer that you were pregnant and know immediately that they were cross-stroke disappointed? All right? How did it articulate itself? How did it manifest itself? And the second question is, why would a boss be cross? 0345 6060 973, that a cherished employee was sharing what could well be the best news of their life. Okay? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. A senior director of a well-known high street bank told me, "You're dead to me now that you're pregnant." He was half joking with a smile, and he said it in front of other colleagues, but privately he berated me and asked how I dared to apply for a promotion knowing that I would be going on maternity leave. Surprisingly, I didn't get the promotion, but I did hire a solicitor and ended up getting a small payout to keep quiet about what had happened. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. £90,000 payout for pregnant hairdresser forced to make tea. And essentially, this is a young woman being punished for being pregnant. And I want to know whether that happened to you at work. Because we spent 2 hours exploring the hideous territory of the Southport killings and some of the contributory factors, I can tell you that if you did fancy contributing to this conversation, your chances of getting through to the studio are the highest that they've been since 10 o'clock on Monday. Because gear changes like this, experience has taught me, might be tricky for me, which is why I've gone off on several completely inappropriate tangents in the course of this introduction, but they're also tricky for you. So we're moving into potentially lighter territory, and we're moving into a story now with which I really need your help because, spoiler alert, I've never told my employer that I'm pregnant.
James O'Brien on LBC.
The Danish state pays for maternity leave. The state, not the employer, unlike the UK where the employer has to pay, says Lisa. Is that? Are you sure? I don't know if that's true. So maybe that's why in Europe you get a different response from your boss as opposed to Denmark. I got one slightly odd message. Here it is. This is from Phil, who says, I retired from running our family after 42 years. I presume you mean family firm, Phil, but, who are we to quibble? After 42 years, and thankfully now well away from the employment law madness. I would guess that this will close the business and probably bankrupt the owner. Never mind, eh? Well, Phil, the message here is if you don't want to be sued for discrimination and constructive dismissal, don't discriminate and constructively dismiss your employees. I would have thought that was fairly obvious, but I suppose we all see what we want to see. And I was surprised that the employer was female because I perhaps somewhat naively, maybe even in an example of casual sexism, thought that a female employer would be less likely to be perturbed by a pregnancy than someone like Phil, who obviously hated it all. Stephen says, medium-sized primary school head teacher. It was hard to be happy for my deputy head when she told me she was pregnant because she was such an amazing colleague and let me get this right, such an amazing colleague and key to the ongoing success of my school. She was off for a year, and although I had employee insurance, I couldn't recruit a temporary deputy head teacher and certainly wouldn't find anyone half as good as her. School accountability is so high, it's very hard when such a key person is off. Whilst I was happy for her, I was worried about my school. That's very honest of you, Stephen. I like that. The idea that perhaps the reason why an employer responds so negatively to news of a pregnancy is because you're such a cherished and valuable employee. I doubt if you've had a horrible experience that you've ever contemplated that possibility, and I very much doubt that Stephen took out his mild misgivings on his colleague. 19 minutes after 12 is the time. If it's happened to you, I want to know how you know it was because you were pregnant that the boss got the hump. I mean, the chronology in this case is irresistible. Literally from the moment she announced it, she was put on special measures, as it were, taken off the online booking system and reduced to doing nothing but cleaning the salon and making the tea. But when it happened to you, how do you know? The media is bad for this, Not this place. This place is exemplary in every imaginable way. But generally speaking, particularly telly, media can be really bad for maternity leave, and not because of the case of the phenomenon of having pregnant women on screen. I've not come across anybody who's got a particular problem with that. More so because it throws things like rotas into disarray, and maternity leave creates gaps that need to be temporarily filled, and it can be hard to find people who can fill a gap temporarily when you kind of want to be offering jobs to people who want full-time work. So I am prepared to listen to employers and explanations of why it can be an absolute pain in the proverbials when a trusted colleague tells you that you're pregnant. And I am also prepared on this occasion to listen to husbands as well. Quite often when we do phone-ins that are essentially female in nature, I'm always struck by the number of men who ring in, and I'm sometimes a bit rude about it, but not on this one, because I could tell you stories about this. They're not my stories to tell, unfortunately, so I can't. But I know that when you announce that you're pregnant in some working environments, the response is pretty grim, actually, and I don't fully understand why. So you can help me with that as well. 21 minutes after 12 is the time. Brian is in Manchester. Brian, what can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello,
yeah, this made me smile when you were talking about this subject because when we had our first son, I was 19. My wife was 18. We weren't married at the time. We're still married after nearly 40 years now.
Lovely.
And she worked for a large employer, one of the large financial institution, and when she told her employer that she was pregnant, she was sacked.
And they could do that back in the 80s. It was acceptable in the 80s. Isn't that a song? They could do that, could they?
Absolutely, yeah. And this is why, I don't think people realise how tough it was in the 80s. Employment law didn't really exist.
No, we had great dance music, though.
We were young, didn't have a lot of support, got on with it, and she had to reapply to get back in, and she got back in, a few months after our eldest son was born. But
good Lord, so no help whatsoever?
Nothing whatsoever, no, because she'd only worked there for about 12 months, and she was I think you had to work there 2 years before you got any type of maternity leave. So that was it. We just had to P45, see you, and if you want to reapply, good luck.
And you took it all in your stride because it was relatively normal, or rather it was acceptable in the 80s?
Well, yeah, I think it was. You just had to get on with it. I was a shop floor worker at the time doing an apprenticeship, and Tracy was working in a financial institution. I won't remember tell you who it was. And,
I can't imagine you'd get into any trouble if you did, but I respect your discretion, Brian.
But just the way the world was, and things evolve, things get better. And I don't know if I understand small businesses, having, keeping up with employment law. It's a big expense for them, but obviously the world needs to sort of support small businesses in being able to support people, ladies who are getting pregnant.
I'm surprised to learn that as recently as that. I was even in the workplace, almost in the workplace then, albeit on a part-time basis. But I don't know when things began to change, and I don't know why bosses get so cross about it. I perhaps need a better explanation. If this is Friday's 12 o'clock topic, James, right, Stephen, is your boss cross? Can we make sure that next week is can cats wear hats? That's from Stephen in Cornwall. Cats can't wear hats, mate. Seriously, 23 after 12 is the time. The other story, there's two things that I needed to tell you about. If you can tell me about a negative reaction from your boss when you announced that you were pregnant, then the number you need is 0345 6060 But have I got the story about the dog? I wanted the story about the dog. Where is it? Here it is. So the Met Office. I heard Ferrari talking about this earlier. I thought someone had spiked his tea, but it's true. The Met Office has warned that pets could be at risk when 80 miles per hour gusts slam into the UK later this week. And it's the next line, which I have never heard before. Brits in coastal parts of the UK should be particularly wary due to large waves coming in from the sea, which could sweep up humans and dogs alike. And people walking near cliffs are also being told to be alert because high winds could see pooches being blown over. Now, I would like to pose this as a sincere and authentic question that you will ring in to reply to, but I think I'm on a hiding for nothing, aren't I? No one has ever seen their pet get blown over. Ever. In fact, I'd have thought having 4 legs makes you much sturdier than your human guardian. I'd have thought 2 legs would be more susceptible to being blown over than 4 legs. But if you have ever seen your pet being blown over... I once took off on Kimber Edge. Have I ever told you about this? I've mentioned Kimber Edge to you a few times recently. It was one of the last places in the country that people lived in caves. It's a tourist attraction. I've always thought it was in Worcestershire, but I think it's actually just in Staffordshire. We used to go there as kids for like a massive... Parkland's not quite the right word, like a country park. And I had a new kite. And we took it to Kimber Edge to fly on a very, very windy day. And it was just me and my dad. And I don't know, it's a day before mobile phones, so I don't know what my dad was distracted by. He'd probably taken a newspaper with him, he usually did. And I'm flying my kite on a really windy day, and it's a brand new kite. And because I realise now my parents were spending so much money on school fees, I didn't often get things in the way that my kids do. Apart from Christmas and birthday, I never ever really got things. I never got... I remember one year we bought a sledge because it was really, really snowing, and that was so exciting because we went out and bought some, but normally it was just Christmas. Probably the same for you growing up. We only really got presents on Christmas and birthday. And I got this kite, and I'm on Kimber Edge flying the kite. It's incredibly windy, and it starts dragging me along the. I can't control the kite, but I'm not going to let go of the kite because I don't get presents very often. I don't get things very often, and I've got a bloody kite. I want to keep the kite. So I'm actually being dragged. I mean, in my memory, I'm rising 2 or 3 inches off the ground, but I think that's unlikely, isn't it? No one's ever... I'd be about 6, and it was quite a big kite. The kite was about as big as me, maybe slightly smaller. In my memory, the kite pulled me off the ground, I certainly remember that you know, the hinterland between running and getting dragged. I certainly remember feeling that I was being dragged along the ground by the kite. And the thing I remember most was my dad shouting at me as he ran across the grassland, "Let go! Let go, son!" So my dad was obviously worried that I was going to be carried away by a kite. Can we get a phone in out of that, do you think? Have you ever been carried away by a... It's all gone a bit Alan Partridge. At least Dan can take the rest of the hour off, can't he, if he's charged with finding the best bits for this programme? 0345 6060 973. So, I want pregnant stories and stories of either being blown over or blown away. And be very careful how you choose your words in this conversation. Laura's in Watford. Laura, what would you like to say? Are you phoning me because of a pregnancy or because of an incident of being blown away?
Because of a pregnancy.
Carry on.
I have got a 2.5-year-old, and when I worked for a company, I got made redundant during COVID, and I managed to get a job at an estate agent that was local, and it was meant to be just a temporary job whilst they found somebody else. Ended up being a full-time contract, and in that year we were trying for a couple of years to get pregnant. In that year I got pregnant, and when I first started the job, they loved me, we got on really well, like me and the boss, we just had a really great relationship. And then as soon as I told him I was pregnant, his demeanour instantly changed. I suffered really badly. I can never pronounce this, but it was with hypergermivitri. I was sick pretty much the minute I opened my eyes when I went to bed. And I managed to drag myself to work with sick bags in the car. So I just thought, I'm not going to let this guy beat me. And I don't know why I put myself through it. And when I was at work, he just gave me the most ridiculous task and told me that I need to dress better and I don't look how I looked when I first started working.
What was he cross about, do you think?
I don't know. And I found that later. So I worked my full term, and I think I left about 4 weeks before I was due to give birth. And I think he was just trying to get me out. I remember at one point I was 7 months pregnant, and it was towards Halloween, and I must have been actually a bit more. I was probably about 6 months in, 7 months, and we had a mural painted on our window for Halloween.
I'm not. It's a mural.
A mural.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, that was rude of me, but mural is so many people do it. It's one of the funniest misspeaks. It's my favourite misspeak. I've got a lovely mural on the wall. Sorry, go on.
And I was one of 2 women that worked at the time. The rest were all gentlemen. And he said to me once the Halloween period was over, "Can you go out and get that off the window?" And this window was like an 8-foot window. Oh. And I thought, I can't do that. And so I did it. And I don't know why I did it. And I went out there and I was outside scraping. And some man random was like, "Is your boss making you do this?" And I was like, "Yeah, he is actually." And that sort of instance. And there was 2 parking spaces outside around the back of the shop. He wouldn't give me one. He made me park where all the other staff
all this parked. Changed when you told him you were pregnant. It was all fine until then.
And he just was rude. Like one point, he shouted at me, and because your emotions are all over the place. I wanted to burst into tears, but I literally thought, "Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't let him do it." And I just basically for a whole 8 months put myself through this stupid, ridiculous thing. Whereas if I ever had more children, I'm not ever doing that again. If I can't do it, I'm not doing it, and it's just a job.
Do you think he wanted you to pack it in?
I think he wanted me to pack it in. Yeah,
so
I truly believe he did. Yeah, and I just.
And how did it end?
I stayed there, and they were all very nice about it. And I found out that when I did leave, his girlfriend, who we didn't really talk much about, he had children of his own. Right. She was pregnant at the same time as me and going through pretty much the same thing. And I found out he didn't want this child. It's all
gone a bit psychological, hasn't it?
Yeah,
so he was projecting his unhappiness about his own girlfriend being pregnant onto you.
Yeah, in a weird way. I just don't get. At the end of the day, I just feel like I get why employers think, "Oh God, we're going to lose her," or it's going to impact their business, and I completely understand that. But at the end of the day,
there's no excuse for that.
It has been for years. Women have babies, and when you employ them,
spoiler alert.
Yeah,
it's exactly right. Thank you, Laura, and thank you for being so gracious at my ungallant correction of your pronunciation. It just tickles me pink. That mural's a much better word for it than a mural. Take care. We're getting close. Here we go. This is from Lisa. A woman and her dog were rescued by strangers after nearly being blown off a cliff in Saltdean in 2019. The problem with trying to find someone who has been blown off a cliff is that it may not have ended well. And that would not be grounds for any sort of levity. But if it did end okay, you get a Ray Liotta all day long. Or if you can tell me hand on heart that your pet has been blown over in the wind. One of my favourite broadcasters, who shall remain nameless because they work for the opposition, has managed to go bi-topical on this subject. She writes, "You're right about media companies. I had 4 weeks, quotes, maternity leave, end quotes, unpaid. The producer of the show I was working on still called me at home to warn me that people were ringing him and asking him to give them my job." Media's a tough old business on this. Look, we get other advantages and other privileges, of course, that are consequences of having a weird job. It didn't occur to me to tell anyone at the time because the whole landscape was pretty toxic, so that was really the least of it. And then in a desperate attempt to go bi-topical, they add, as a sidebar, me and the dog have just been out and about, and we were really struggling through the winds up by Ali Pali. Yeah, but you didn't get blown over, did you? The Met Office has warned that pets could be at risk when 80-mile-per-hour gusts slam into the UK later this week. High winds could see pooches being blown over, writes the Daily Mirror. Really? Says James O'Brien. Tim Humphrey, meanwhile, has the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:36 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. As promised, the first video game review on the programme for a very, very long time. And I speak of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which is currently only available on the Xbox, which a couple of you picked up on, because I've previously revealed in the past that I am the proud owner of a PlayStation 5. So I got a couple of messages saying, ooh, a PS5 and an Xbox, get you. Actually, I turned out I can play Xbox games on my telly. I don't know if that makes me sound less privileged or more privileged. So I've got a Samsung telly that has an app on it that lets you play Xbox games. You have to pay for them. You have to subscribe. So I don't actually have an Xbox except for the one that's somehow built into my tiny, incredibly wafer-thin. This isn't going well, is it? I thought I'll explain that I don't have a PlayStation and an Xbox in an attempt to stop you thinking that I'm some sort of champagne socialist. And now I'm describing my wafer-thin television that is so state-of-the-art it's got a built-in Xbox. Anyway, that's what I've been playing it on. You can even use your PlayStation controllers on the... You don't care, do you? No. So it's brilliant. It's exactly what you'd expect or hope an Indiana Jones game would be. It's a mixture of combat and adventure, investigation and problem solving, and you can do everything from sort of wander around archaeological dig sites to explore the Vatican, and you have lots of concurrent missions as well. That might be normal now, but it's a like Grand Theft Auto type of thing. There's lots of different things you can do. It's not entirely linear. My only criticism would be that the fighting is simplistic and repetitive. You know, it's not like God of War or something like that, where you can get really sophisticated button mashing combos going on. It's really quite straightforward. But to give you an idea of the detail, right, you're wandering around a German barracks in disguise as a German soldier, or as a priest perhaps, in the Vatican. And you can hit Nazis, I should say. You can hit Nazis with anything you can find, pretty much. And you can even pick up a guitar. This is one of the most satisfying sound effects I've ever encountered in a video game. You can pick up a guitar, hit a Nazi over the head with it, and you get a kind of twing type noise. That might not be the kind of thing that real video game aficionados are looking for in this exclusive review of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, but it's certainly what impacted the most upon me. Eleanor would like to contribute to this, having looked up the video game online. She says lots of earthy tones in this video. Do you mean the colours? Earthy tones? Well, it's Indiana Jones, isn't it? It's like archaeology sites and sand-coloured safari suits and all that kind of thing. It's beautiful. Great voice acting, fantastic plotting, and quite nicely sophisticated. All right, you barely use your gun. You've got it. You can use it if you want, but you're much better off not doing so. And highly recommended by me. 5 stars, James O'Brien. There it is. Another broadcasting friend of mine, they're all listening today. They don't listen to the stations they work for. They all listen to me, which is why I can't tell you their name. Another one has just messaged me to say, I've only just tuned in. WTF is going on? It's live video game reviews, mate. You should try it on your show tomorrow. Seriously, it's what the people want. 12:39 is the time. Back to the cross boss, the unpleasant and unacceptable reaction you received when you told your boss you were pregnant. Jolie is in York. Jolie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Jolie.
I founded the charity and campaign group Pregnant Then Screwed after my own experience of pregnancy discrimination. It was going to be worse than that.
Just for people who are slow on the uptake, it's normally the other way around. That's why it's a very good name for a campaign group. Can't Jolie?
Yeah, the number of people that try and explain procreation to me is astounding. So I founded it after I experienced pregnancy discrimination. I informed my employer that I was pregnant. I was 4 months pregnant.
Yeah.
I sent them an email saying, look, I've just found out I'm pregnant, but don't worry, I have a plan to hand over my project. Can you call me tomorrow and we'll talk it through?
So you were already worried in this point? You were already doing sort of damage limitation psychologically?
Yeah, it was a year-long contract I was working on, and I got pregnant in the middle of it. So I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to finish the contract. So I got a plan together. I had somebody ready to step in, and they called me the next day and just said, we're pulling your contract. Can you please hand everything over immediately? So I was, and it was a charity. It was a children's charity that did that to me.
A children's charity? A children's charity?
Yeah.
Oh, the irony.
And it was a woman that pushed me out. And you find with these cases that women are just as bad at it as men are. So
that's coming clear to me in my inbox. Why do you think? I mean, I'm not in any way excusing it. We often distinguish between excuse and explanation. But why do so many bosses get so cross about it?
Well, I think they see you as a burden to their business, and we know from research that you're seen as distracted and less committed to your job from the point that you get pregnant. So they think, well, you're now going to prioritise your child, you're not going to prioritise your work, we're going to have to pay your maternity leave, we're going to have to find cover, you're just becoming a bit of a problem, so we'd just rather you left.
Even now. So in 1984, when Brian's wife was fired, it was fairly commonplace. I thought we'd won this battle, or I thought this battle had been won.
It has definitely not. We know that 54,000 women a year are pushed out of their job for getting pregnant.
How do you know that? 54,000? How do you know that? Where does that number come from?
It's government data from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. The last research report was done in 2016, so it's almost 10 years old, but it's really good quality data. So it's 1 in 9 pregnant women will get pushed out of their job. It's a woman every 10 minutes that loses her job for getting pregnant.
Terrible.
And actually, we think that data has got worse, not better, over the last 10 years.
Why would that be?
Well, I guess with the economic situation in particular, and when you're thinking you're going to have to make redundancies, it tends to be pregnant women and new mothers that are the first to go because they're just stigmatised as being distracted and less committed. So they're sort of easy prey, if you like, particularly if you're on maternity leave. So we get calls at Pregnant Then Screwed all the time of them saying they're making redundancies, but they're only making women on maternity leave redundant.
Oh, so they're not really being and of course, and another thing you can help me with is I presume it's a bit of it's quite a big headache to actually take action. So that's why constructive dismissal is such an insidious practice, isn't it? Because they kind of push you into a position where you can't take it anymore. You walk away. You've been constructively dismissed, but I need another word to describe like a headache that isn't the word that rhymes with bag, because I always want to say on the radio, Jolie, it'd be such a word that rhymes with bag. I don't know what the other word is, so I'll go with headache. It'd be such a headache to get a lawyer, go to tribunal. They bank on the fact that most people won't do that, right?
Yeah, well, you only have 3 months to raise a tribunal claim from the point that discrimination occurs. So I found out I was having a high-risk pregnancy. I discovered that my cervix had almost vanished, and had my baby arrived any time soon, he would have died. And I was told to reduce stress in my life, but so I only had 3 months to raise this tribunal claim, and I was literally left with the choice between accessing the justice I deserved or protecting the health of my unborn child. Yeah. And of course, if you've just had a baby, you can barely get dressed every day, let alone mastermind a tribunal.
Yes,
so we're dealing with women who are in really vulnerable states and asking them to do something monumentally stressful and difficult and expensive. And of course, they're just not capable of doing it. So fewer than 1% of women who experience pregnancy or maternity discrimination even raise a tribunal claim because it's so difficult to do, and the justice system just doesn't work for them.
Wow. I've got a hat trick, Jolie. I've got my third well-known broadcaster who is listening to this programme instead of their own station's output has been in touch to say, "Oh my God, I love Jolie. I can't believe that she's just rang your show and you didn't have to book her as a guest. Ask her what her campaign group has changed." So you've got another big fan here. But what has Pregnant Then Screwed changed since you set it up in 2015?
Well, we've helped over 300,000 women with free legal advice and support. We've secured over £10 million for women in settlement agreements after they've experienced discrimination.
Bloody hell.
We were involved in the £5.2 billion investment in childcare, because, of course, childcare is a massive issue for working mothers.
Of course.
We organised March of the Mummies, where we got 15,000 parents out in 10 cities across the UK to march for reform on childcare, parental leave and flexible working. It's the biggest protest the world has ever seen of working parents. And we've changed flexible working laws and redundancy protection laws so that you are now protected from... You have enhanced protection from redundancy when you're pregnant, when you're on maternity leave, and when for 6 months after you return to work. And we're not done yet.
In 10 years? Just under 10 years?
In 10 years, yeah.
And I think you've just stepped down as CEO, I'm reading on the website, but obviously the work continues.
The work continues, yeah. I will still be talking about this as much as humanly possible to make sure everybody knows it's still happening.
This is all well and good, Jolie Brearley. But have you ever seen a dog blown over in the wind?
I took my dog out in the wind this morning and did worry that might happen.
But
and
no.
I would quite enjoy seeing a dog blown over in the wind.
Well, I'm still searching the radio equivalent. In the meantime, can I give you this, please?
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
Oh,
if you build
you.
it,
you're very welcome.
They will come.
And you can find Pregnant Then Screwed with great ease on the internet, pregnantthenscrewed.com. Incredible work. And the founder and outgoing Chief Executive Officer, Jolie, there listing a roster of achievements of which anybody would be proud. And, of course, achievements born of an unpleasant experience of telling your boss that the best news you could hope for in life, often, that you're pregnant. And then your boss doesn't just rain on your parade, but tries to ruin it. I'm feeling a bit inadequate in all sorts of ways. Tony's been in touch. He says, James, Ian Payne had a lady on this morning whose dog got blown over while having a wee, and it went all over her slippers. She said that she threw the slippers away. And then Tony adds rather beautifully, must be rich.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Just got back from a morning walk, writes Lorna. Little dog was almost blown over. He hit the ground, laid flat until the gust subsided. My hand was on my fast-beating heart. Yeah. Almost blown over. Or if you follow me on Blue Sky, and if you don't, why not? You can see that I've just been sent some footage by Phil of dogs almost being blown over, but as far as I can tell, none of them actually are, although one comes perilously close. I don't believe the Met Office, who have issued a warning this morning that high winds could see pooches being blown over, warning you to... obviously, waves are no laughing matter, but why do people go near the sea on days like this? It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? It's the other sort of thing. It's going to play havoc with my algorithm, isn't it? Looking at videos of dogs almost being blown over in the wind. I hope it doesn't spoil my supply of people falling over in comical circumstances. But wind blowing over dogs, no actual examples of it yet, although it nearly happened to Lorna. If you follow me on Blue Sky, at Mr. James O.B., as I often am, that is on my feed now. I've shared that on there. Some of it's quite, but it makes me laugh anyway. I am currently scheduled to be off for the first 2 weeks in February. Keith, stop celebrating. You don't know who's going to be standing in for me, mate. I'd be careful. Those celebrations might be a little bit premature. Frankly, sometimes I dread to think. But even though I am scheduled to be off for the first 2 weeks in February, I will be on stage on the 10th of February at the Leicester Square Theatre in the hope of raising a ton of money for MakeSomeNoise.com. MakeSomeNoise.com, or rather Make Some Noise, is Global's charity, Global's Make Some Noise, that operates as a sort of umbrella under which lots of little charities that can't afford marketing budgets or to do much promotion sort of sit, and we help them. So we raise a ton of money, as you know, on Make Some Noise Day, but actually the work goes on throughout the entire year. And then we divvy it up to the little charities. And sometimes presenters have the extraordinary privilege and pleasure of delivering not just the check, but the news. Quite often, for example, I get to tell a small charity looking after disabled children on one occasion that we've actually managed to get double what they wanted, because when they submitted their application, we saw what they could do with the money and decided to provide all of it, even though they'd only been asking for half of it. So we do absolutely incredible work. There's one memory I have of a little lad who was born missing a limb. He was born with one arm. And the charity that we supported that year provided weekends away for families, for entire families, where a child lacked a limb, didn't have a limb, either through birth or as a consequence of an accident. And he was only a little lad. And I asked him why it was so important, why going away on a weekend where every other family was in a similar condition would be better than just going away to Centre Parks for a weekend, as normal. And to his credit, he didn't look at me as if I was stupid. But he could have been forgiven for doing so, because the answer was so obvious when he said it. He said it's the only time in the year when we don't have to explain anything to anybody. So even his little sister would be asked at the playground, why has your brother only got one arm? Parents would be asked, how did that happen? The only time they ever didn't have to explain anything to anybody was when they went away for the weekend as a consequence of the work of the charity that we supported with Global's Make Some Noise. So I always get stuck into it every year, and usually that involves me doing a special one-off live recording of Full Disclosure, my podcast, on stage at the Leicester Square Theatre. You can listen back to past ones. I've done Keir Starmer, and I've done Lily Pullman, the Holocaust survivor that I was talking to you about earlier, who sadly is no longer with us. And this year it is Carol Vorderman, who of course was compelled by her schedule to step down from LBC not long ago, but with whom I'm sure you will be keen to catch up. It's fair to say she's not exactly backwards in coming forwards, and with Carol on a stage like that, absolutely nothing will be off limits. And you get to ask questions as well. If you're very good, I might even let you ask me some. It's on the 10th of February. It's on Monday, the 10th of February. All proceeds will go to Make Some Noise and help us help people right across the UK from life's toughest challenges: homelessness, food poverty, life-limiting illness, mental health, isolation, all sorts of things. So if you are in a position to help, why not buy a ticket and come along? Because you have a wonderful night out and get to meet me and Carol, but you're also doing incredible good at the same time. So go to makesomenoise.com to find out more and to get your tickets. These small projects really do need support. Now more than ever, I doubt you need me to tell you this, but me and Carol certainly don't get paid for this. It's absolutely 100% to raise money for Make Some Noise, and we are doing it to make sure that no one is left facing life's toughest challenges alone. I look forward to seeing you there. As I said, makesomenoise.com is the address that you need. I'm here next week, but currently scheduled not to be here for the first 2 weeks in February. Back to, hang on a minute. Amanda is in Dublin. Amanda, what made you pick up the phone?
My partner's cousin actually did end up falling off a cliff in a storm.
Not falling off. I need to be clear. Blown off a cliff. I mean, you mentioned the storm, but it was the wind that did it.
Yeah. He walks the dog along the same. It's like a cliff path.
Yeah.
It's part of, I think, the Wicklow Way. And that evening there were storms. He wasn't.
Yeah.
I don't think he should have been walking the dog, really.
No, clearly not.
It's a big, fluffy thing that needs a lot of walking.
Right.
So he was walking along the cliff path, got blown off, ended up in the water. He's a really, really strong swimmer, and it's obviously got a happy ending, but that's quite severe. He fell off a cliff into the sea. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In the wind, and the dog, did he let go of the lead?
Well, the dog turned up afterwards, so the dog was fine.
The dog didn't get blown off the cliff?
I'm not sure that the dog didn't end up in the same place that he did.
Good grief.
So I think they both got blown off, but the dog ended up somewhere else and was picked up elsewhere. But he had done life-saving when he was younger, so he knew when he hit the water, first thing he did was take off his shoes and his big heavy coat so that he could kind of keep himself afloat, and he felt himself being drawn out by the tide, so he swam really, really, really hard, as hard as he could against that, and he got to a sandy bit, like a cove bit, and basically pulled himself up, and he was exhausted, and he just stayed there until the morning time, about 6 o'clock in the morning. The Coast Guard came round.
I'm not surprised. What an extraordinary story. I bet you didn't think you'd be telling it on the radio when you woke up this morning, did you?
Well, we tell it to lots of people.
Well, I bet you do, actually. It is an incredible story. My cousin got blown off a cliff. And everyone lived, and they all lived happily ever after, just to be absolutely clear.
Oh, yeah, he got treated for hypothermia, and I think he had a badly sprained ankle, and the dog turned up too. But the Coast Guard said to him when he picked him up that he was so relieved to find that he was alive. Because
could so easily have gone wrong. He'd have been dragged out to sea.
Well, normally that's where bodies wash up. So,
well, blimey, God. Well, no, I like it. It's a good story, but it's got that nice little frisson of terror at the end. It's like a Halloween blown off a cliff story. Amanda, take care. Last word of the week goes to Jamie, who's in Burntwood. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. You asked earlier if anyone had ever been blown away by a kite.
Pulled away by a kite. Carried away by a kite.
Kind of, yeah. In my 20s, I worked for a company called TKC, which stood for the Kite Company.
They're big old kites, power kites.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And at the time, I only had a 3-metre power kite, and I took that out with this girl that I was trying to impress on a bit of a date.
Yeah.
To Crosby.
Oh, yeah.
And flying it on the grass there, and the wind was a little bit too windy for a kite of that size, and literally dragged me across the field on my face to the point where I eventually had to let go before I hit the road. The kite then proceeded to go up over the block of flats.
Did you ever see it again? Did you ever see the kite again?
I did, actually. Miraculously, it came down.
Because they're worth a bit, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and it happened again.
You didn't learn your lesson. You didn't learn your lesson.
I bought a bigger kite.
Of course you did.
And flew it at Bath Race Course one day with a friend, and ended up about 12 feet in the air with it.
12 feet in the... Oh, come off it. Is there footage?
It was a 6-metre power kite.
Well, actually, they're the ones that you use at the beach, isn't it? And you can attach all sorts of... It's 12 feet off the ground, and you hung on to it and came back down again.
Oh, yeah, I came back down with a crash, and sheepishly said, right, that's a little bit too windy. So I never did learn my lesson.
The only thing we haven't done today, we've had someone blown off a cliff and someone carried off by a kite, but we haven't found a dog that got blown over in the wind, although I've got people claiming that they have, but it's not good enough if they're doing it on a text. Jamie wants to know, is there a bar at the venue where you're doing your thing with Carol Vorder? I said, mate, come off it. I don't have many riders. But my goodness me, there has to be a bar if I'm going to do a performance anywhere. So yes, and I'll see you there after the show. That's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, I can see Vanessa Feltz thinking, how am I going to follow this? How can you follow a bloke who got carried off by a kite? How long have you been a broadcaster, Vanessa?
35 years.
This is your greatest challenge yet.
I'll do my best.
This is your greatest challenge yet. Don't forget that you can listen to Global Player if you want to pause and rewind live radio. All the podcasts are there, including the brand new, and it may be the last day we use that term, James O'Brien Daily, the best bits of my show in a 60-minute package every day. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4, but now standing in for Sheila, it's Vanessa Feltz.
James O'Brien on LBC.